All right, I guess we can get everyone to be quiet for just a sec. We're starting a little bit late, but in the meantime, what we're going to do is, in advance, have myself from the Secular Student Alliance and this gentleman here from Set Free just kind of let everyone know who we are and when we meet. That way, if anyone's interested in continuing this discussion at a later time, you can come to either of those. And we're going to also give Matt an opportunity, wherever he is, there he is, to mention Philosophy Club, and if anyone's interested on campus, to do that as well. I'll let you go first.
Okay. My name is Paul Rains, and I'm with Set Free. We're an on-campus organization and Bible study group, and we meet every Tuesday night. We are on campus several nights each week, and we're really just letting the students know about our Bible study. We meet on Tuesdays, every Tuesday at 7 p.m. up in the university room, 264 upstairs in the UC. And we meet every week, and what I like promoting it is we talk about the big question. Where are you going to go when you die? And important life questions. And we try to give answers from the Bible and things that you can rest your faith on. So that is a little bit about our group, and there's much more we discuss. It's really kind of an open thing where we try to get students, they can ask questions if they have, but every week we have a program, and everyone's welcome to come to that.
All right, then I'm Scott Janis. I'm the president of the Secular Student Alliance UW Whitewater chapter here. A little bit about our group. We meet every Tuesday at 7 o'clock p.m. again, just like these guys do. We might be changing that next semester, but in the meantime, that's what we do. We meet every other week for a pre-decided, kind of planned out presentation and then a discussion following where we talk about anything from what the campus life is like, to the separation of church and state with respect to current issues like religious freedom. We talk about each other's beliefs and our own or lack thereof. And it's usually a lot of fun every other week where we're not doing that. We'll have a discussion, or we might just go do something as a social group for people who might not be able to find many more people who have that same perspective or want to exchange them openly in a social environment. So it's definitely worth going to. We usually meet at Highland 1319, so that's just downstairs, 7 o'clock on Tuesdays, and we hope to see you there.
Hello? Hello. Hi. My name is Matthew Schultz. I'm the current president of the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater Philosophy Club, and I thank you for coming to our debate. We have two separate guest speakers coming in tonight. The first is Thomas Ross. Just a little bit about Thomas. He grew up doubting the existence of God in a very, very non-Christian home. And he was born again in October 1995 during freshman year at college, shortly before his 16th birthday. He got a BA from the University of California, Berkeley. He has a Master's of Arts at Fairhaven Baptist College during 2001, Master's of Divinity at Great Plains Baptist Divinity School in 2007. He also has a Master's of Theology at Anchor Baptist Theological Seminary during 2009, and he's currently working on his PhD at Great Plains Baptist Divinity School, estimated to be 2015. He is currently a professor at Baptist College of Ministry and Theological Seminary, a ministry of Falls Baptist Church in Menominee, thank you. Menominee Falls, Wisconsin. He is the assistant professor teaching postgraduate and undergraduate courses in Greek and classical Hebrew, starting in 2012. Also a professor at the McGuanago Baptist Institute, a ministry of McGuanago Baptist Church, teaching biblical languages and theological studies. Starting from 2006 to present, he also preaches at the McGuanago Baptist Church and has also held in the past various other teaching positions. He regularly reads the Greek New Testament and Hebrew Old Testament as part of his devotional studies. He has read through the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew Torah, and the Aramaic portions of Scripture can translate at sight large portions of the Greek New Testament and much of the Hebrew Old Testament. Our second speaker tonight is going to be Dan Barker. He has received a degree in religion from Azusa Pacific University and was ordained to the ministry by the Stanford Community Church. It was located in California in the year 1970. He served as associate pastor at the Religious Society of Friends Church, an Assembly of God, and an independent charismatic church. In 1984, he announced to his friends that he was an atheist. He appeared on AM Chicago, hosted by Oprah Winfrey later that year, on a show about kicking the religion habit. Barker met Annie Laurie Gaylor when both were guests on the show. They began dating 6 months later and were married in the year 1987. They have a daughter, Sabrina Delata. Excuse me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. He is also the current co-president with his wife of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, an American free thought organization that promotes the separation of church and state. Barker is co-host of Free Thought Radio, a radio program on the radio station WXXM, a channel targeting atheists, agnostics, and other free thinkers that have included interviews with Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Steven Pinker, and Julia Sweeney. Baker is a successful musician and composed over 200 songs that have been published or recorded. To this day, he receives royalties from his popular children's Christian musicals, Mary Had a Little Lamb in 1977, and His Fleece Was as White as Snow in 1978. Both published by Manna Music. Dan Barker also speaks fluent Spanish and is studying other languages. He belongs to a number of high IQ societies, including the Prometheus Society, with an entrance requirement in the 99.997th percentile. May I call both of the presenters to the front at this time. This is Thomas Ross on my right, and this is Dan Barker on my left. I am assuming that Thomas is going to be going first.
Nope.
Oh, Dan Barker?
I have the affirmative. So.
You do?
Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yes, he does. My apologies
That's
once
what they
again.
said.
All right, and I will leave you to have the floor.
And I'm actually going to sit back down.
So you can hear me through this mic, okay? Well, that is interesting. Usually I go second. Usually I'm the negative in these debates. But the topic was the Old Testament is mainly fiction, not fact. So while ordinarily I'm Daniel in the lion's den, tonight he's doubting Thomas because he's doubting the affirmative. So that's nice. It's a nice change. So we have 20-minute opening statements. Maybe I can do it quicker than 20 so we can get to questions from the audience, because I know you people are the reason we're here tonight. So if you've read The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, turn with me in your book, God Delusion, to chapter 2, verse 1. The first sentence of The God Delusion says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." And I agree with Richard Dawkins 100%. If that God did exist, we have a moral obligation to denounce the immorality of such a tyrant. However, we're not talking about the moral truth of the Bible. We're talking about whether it's fictional or not. Richard Dawkins asked me to document each of those 19 nasty adjectives with Bible verses, which was easy to do. And then he said, you know what? That would make a good book, pun intended. A good book with one chapter for each of those 19 adjectives. So you could go to it and look up, What do you mean God was an ethnic cleanser? What do you mean he was misogynistic? What do you mean he was infanticidal? So next February, I wrote the book, he wrote the foreword. The book is coming out February 2nd. It's called God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. And that's our debate tonight. It's a fiction. The Old Testament is itself mainly fictional. It has a little bit of history in it. I'm reading right now one of the novels of Stephen King. In fact, it's the first Stephen King novel I've ever read. It's called The Stand, which is really pretty fun, pretty gruesome. But in this novel, there's a Las Vegas, there's a Los Angeles, there's a Central Park in New York, there's a Terre Haute, Indiana, there's the state of Vermont, the state of Maine, there's Chevrolets. There's a lot of things that are actually historical things in that novel that really do exist. Is Stephen King's novel, The Stand, a historical book? No, it isn't. It's what you would call historical fiction. The Old Testament is historical fiction. You will find some history in it. You will find some places that actually do exist. But that doesn't mean that the story itself is actually a true historical story. I used to be an ordained minister, as you heard. I'm not a professional Bible scholar. I did preach from every book of the Bible, and I continue to study the Bible and can also read the New Testament in the Greek and can quote much of it from memory, as if that matters at all that you can say it in that original language. En archi hino logos, ke logos in proston theon. You all know John 1:1. So that's kind of important to be able to quote the scriptures in its own language. But really, is it a historical, is it a true book? I'm not a professional historian. I just preached the gospel because I believed it with all my heart, that Jesus was my Lord and Savior. I confessed my sins. I thought his death on the cross paid the penalty for my sin, and his resurrection gave me the promise of eternal life. And I preached that for 19 years. I was wrong. Tom is wrong. You believers in this audience who are Christians, I'm sorry. I know how deep it is. I used to get goosebumps. I used to feel it. I used to see it. But it's wrong. It's not fact. It is fiction. I have 5 arguments to show that the Old Testament is fictional. The first one is that there is no archaeological evidence for any of the stories that we find in the Old Testament. 2, there is no literary evidence for any of the stories that we find in the Old Testament. 3, the literary evidence itself shows parallels with ancient mythology. The stories that we find in the Old Testament are cut from the same fabric of other ancient mythologies. 4, there are many historical anachronisms in the Old Testament, things which simply cannot be true. They are mistakes that the authors made. And 5, this is the weakest argument, but I put it in anyway because it's more philosophical than anything. The stories are really outrageous. Outrageous claims require outrageous proof. We don't have outrageous proof with these claims. There were many religious folk tales and myths in the 1st and 2nd millennium BCE. The Greeks, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Indians, the Egyptians, the Assyrians. There were Ugaritic myths. There were Sicilian, Mesopotamian, Sumerian. So many of these myths and foundational stories with all sorts of clearly mythical and magical events in them, none of which we take seriously on historical grounds. None of which you take seriously on historical grounds. The gods on the top of Mount Olympus, for example. The divine birth of Hercules. All these things that we all know, come on, that's mythology. The ancient Israelites had their own version of a foundational story. There was a first man made from mud. His name was Adam. Then the woman was pulled out of his side from his rib. According to science, by the way, according to the fact of evolution, there could not have been an Adam and an Eve. That's impossible. There could not have been a first man and a first woman. But even if there were, they would have come out of Africa, not out of the Middle East. This foundational story was clearly written by people who didn't know much about science or biology. There's a magic tree in a pristine garden. There's a talking snake who tempts the woman. By the way, if you look up the word fable in the dictionary, you will see, for example, here's American Heritage. A fable is a usually short narrative making an edifying or cautionary point, often employing as characters animals that speak and act like human beings. The Israelite story has a talking animal. It has two talking animals, actually. There was Balaam's ass. Animals don't talk, by the way. They don't have vocal cords. That's one of the ways we know this is a mythical story. There's this unforgiving angel with a flaming sword barring entry into the garden. There's an unforgiving God character who destroys every living thing in a worldwide flood, for which there is no evidence, by the way. Their cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed with fire and brimstone. A woman was turned into salt. There was the story of the captivity in Egypt by these Israelite slaves. Sticks turning into snakes. The Nile River turning into blood. A one-day exit of 2 or 3 million people from Egypt into the Exodus. The Exodus story, the crossing of a Red Sea, which, by the way, was totally unnecessary. You can get to the Sinai Peninsula without having to go all the way down south across the Red Sea. That was clearly added as a mythical story because there were a lot of other sea-ocean crossing stories and other mythologies too, so the Israelites wanted to have one of their own. They could have got there much more easily than having to go down and cross this Red Sea. There's a pillar of fire. There's a burning bush that talks. There's a race of giants called the Nephilim. A lot of these mythologies had giants in their stories. There's food falling from the sky. There were trillions of quail that were blown up out of the ocean to feed these people. There was water that came from a rock that was being struck. By the way, the Persian god Mithra shot an arrow into a rock and water came out of it too. Moses hit the rock with a rod. Very similar parallel stories that were going on back then. There's clothing that did not wear out for 40 years. There's this mountain in the Sinai Peninsula from which a lawgiver goes up to the top to get the law, just like the Greeks went up to the top of Olympus. Many other mythologies back then, they had to go up, as if God were a physical kind of a being that has a high and a low, as if he had to go up to the top of something to get to this being. This God of these Israelites kills all the followers of Korah by opening the earth and swallowing them up. That looks like a big action hero movie. Wouldn't that be something to see on TV? They disagree with Moses' authority, just like Luther disagreed with the Pope. So what did Moses do? You're dead. That's the story in there. Korah and 250 of his followers. There's a massive military conquest of Canaan for which there is no historical evidence. Where are all those implements of warfare? Where are all the chariots? Where are all these these captive slaves suddenly became these fierce warring soldiers and went in and did all of this killing? There's no evidence for any of that. God kills the Amorites with these meteorites from the sky, and then he makes the sun and the moon stand still. Human skeletons that are dead come back to life and walk around. A disembodied hand floats in the air and writes on the wall, many, many tekel ufarsim. And on and on and on and on. These Israelites have these stories that sound, quite frankly, and if you're honest, you have to admit, compared with other mythologies, they sound quite mythological, don't they? They are not the kinds of things that we would ordinarily say, yeah, that happened. Like what if I told you, when I came up here to this building, a black and white cat came up to me and said, Dan, welcome to the University of Whitewater. I hope you have a great time here. How many of you believe that happened? Why not? Are you all a bunch of skeptics? Why don't you believe that story? What if I wrote it down? A talking cat spoke to me. Would you believe it? Why don't you believe it? Are you doubters? You don't believe it because you know cats don't talk. It's a crazy story. It's an outrageous story. And you're much more likely to think that I'm making it up, right, than that it actually happened. Well, if you're likely to think that about me, why not think that about the ancient Israelites? They made it up. There is no archaeological evidence for any of those stories that I just told you. Any of them. You will find archaeological evidence for certain cities and certain groups of people. But if anyone should care about this foundational myth, the Jews themselves and the Israelis should care. But did you know that almost all rabbis will tell you the stories of the Old Testament are allegorical? They were not historical. In the Jewish temple in Madison, Wisconsin, where I played the piano once for a wedding, I look at the Torah, and right in the preface it says, these stories are not to be taken literally. These are just stories. They're like legends, right? The Jews themselves treat these stories as legends, as myths. The Israelis over in Israel, if anyone would care about the foundational story of the nation of Israel, the Israeli scholars themselves should. And yet the archaeologists over there are throwing up their hands saying, nope, there's nothing. None of these stories has any archaeological evidence at all. Israel Finkelstein, for example, who teaches there in Israel, they had access to the Sinai Peninsula. They were able to look and see, was there a group of 2 or 3 million people wandering in that peninsula for 40 years with all their cattle and all their tents? No, there was not. The Israeli archaeologists and historians themselves agree that the story is mythological. It did not happen. Where is the evidence for that supposed Exodus? Where's the evidence for the huge military conquest of Canaan? Where are all the bones of the thousands of giants that supposedly lived during that time? The Nephilim that scared the Israelites so much that they had to huddle back. Even though they had this huge God, they were afraid of the giants for 40 years. My second point is that there's no literary evidence for any of the stories that are in the Old Testament. No mention of them in any culture. Greece, Babylonia, Persia, India, that were contemporary with the time. Egypt of all things, who kept a lot of records, should have made notice of the 3 days of darkness, or the Nile River turning to blood, or 3 million slaves escaping across the river. Egypt should have had some stories about these things. Nothing. Silence. The literary record is completely silent about these stories in the Old Testament. The Assyrians, the Ugaritic, the Mesopotamians, and so on. The plagues that supposedly killed all the Egyptians and all their livestock, that would have been bigger than a 9/11 story that we're remembering here. Would have been bigger than what just happened in France. Much, much bigger. Yet nothing. Egyptian history, Egyptian literary records are silent about these Israelite myths that the Israelites made up. My third point is that there are many literary parallels and precursors to the Israelite stories in many other mythologies of the time. It looks like the Israelites, to a large degree, were copying and mimicking stories. Like, for example, there were at least 50, maybe 60 other lawgivers and reformers of the time. And isn't it interesting that a whole bunch of them were two-syllable names starting with the letter M? Not just Moses, but there was also Manis, there was Manis in Phrygia, there was Manus in the Germany area, there was Manu in India, there was Minos in Crete, there was Menes in Egypt, there was Monius in Egypt, another Monius in Egypt, and then in Greek there was a Musaeus, like Moses. So, and there were a bunch more of them. The fleeing from oppression was a theme that showed up in a lot of the ancient mythology and other pagan exoduses. Crossing of the seas, the slaughter of innocents, the magical rods, the plagues and the pestilences. These stories that were floating around had people wandering in the wilderness for a long time. They had water coming out of a rock. They had food coming down from heaven. They had mythical giants in their stories, just like the Israelites had these mythical giants in their stories. They had these testimonies of covenants and testimonies and their laws and all these things. And they got their laws from the top of a mountain here and there. And even Egyptian pygmies had a mountaintop myth of going up to get the law from their God. So there was common currency. It wasn't exactly a template, but it was like you could see that the Israelite stories were cut from the same fabric of all these ancient pagan myths of the time. Not exactly. Everyone is different, obviously. If they weren't different, we wouldn't have comparative religion. So each one put their own wrinkles on it. But you can see that there's a good naturalistic explanation for the story that does not require us to bend the laws of nature and have talking snakes and talking donkeys. If you have to make yourself believe that, there's something wrong with your reasoning process to think, well, God can do miracles. A cat can talk, a donkey can talk, although you were skeptical of my story, just like I am skeptical of the story of the Israelites. Number 4, there are many historical mistakes in the Old Testament. There are anachronisms. How are we doing for time? Oh, good, perfect. For example, there were many cities mentioned in the Old Testament that did not exist at the time. The city of, how do you pronounce it? Ai, was supposedly ruined. That word I, by the way, in the original means ruins. But at the time it was supposedly happened, that city wasn't even there. The Philistines were much later than the supposed patriarchal time. There were no Philistines inhabiting that coast there in southern Canaan at that time. That's a later story, as if the later writers in the 5th and 6th century BC knew about it and thought it was ancient enough to be in their old patriarchal stories. The Aramaeans, who are mentioned in the Bible, were not actually there at that time those stories were supposedly happening. The land of Goshen, that word Goshen itself, referring to part of Egypt, that was a later phrase that they did not use back in the time when Moses lived. But probably most damning is camels. The patriarchal stories mentions camels, camel caravans and herds of camels. Did you know that there were no domesticated camels during the time of the patriarchs? And yet the stories about Joseph and Abraham talk about these camels carrying the goods because the later writers didn't know that camels weren't that old. In fact, there's been studies in Tel Aviv magazine. They showed the introduction of domestic camels, not just wild camels, but domestic camels used as in herds and in caravans. They pinpointed it to around the year 930 BC when camels basically were domesticated. Way too late for them to appear in the Old Testament stories. That's a mistake. That's an anachronism. The Old Testament writers goofed. And so on. Of course, Moses could not have written the book of Genesis because whoever wrote it describes Moses' death and burial. So it was obviously somebody else who wrote it. And my fifth point, of course, is that outrageous claims require outrageous proof. You can discard this one if you want. We don't even need this argument. But really, when you think about it, these are pretty outrageous claims. They're claims that nobody in their right mind would go, oh yeah, that happened. But if you're raised in a religion where you feel the love of God and you want to know Jesus and you want a Bible book for you, then suddenly that all becomes true in your brain. You surrender the rational thinking. You surrender what historians and scholars know they must do to be honest with history and evaluate things probabilistically. What's the probability that that cat spoke to me out there? It's not zero, but it's very, very low. What's the probability that a snake spoke human language? It's not zero, but it's very, 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 it's so low that we can round it off to zero. By the way, do not accuse me of having a priori bias against the supernatural. My argument is not that the supernatural cannot happen, because I wasn't there, you weren't either. You weren't there when I saw the cat out front. My argument is that if we want to do good history, we have to assign those events very low probabilities. So the fact that there's no archaeological evidence, there is no contemporary literary confirmation, there are historical anachronisms in the stories, the Old Testament stories appear to be cut from the same fabric as other ancient mythologies, and the tales are too outrageous to be believed on their own merits, leaves us no choice. If you're an open-minded, rational person, it leaves you no choice but to conclude that the Old Testament is mainly fiction.
Just very, very quickly, many of you have received question forms at the very beginning. If you don't mind passing them to the side rows for them to be picked up for when they will be asked during our 10-minute break, as well as at the very end, in which there's unlimited time for questions. The rest of the debate will be a 20-minute opening from Mr. Ross, followed by 10 minutes each for a rebuttal and 5 minutes each for a cross-examination, followed by a 10-minute break. Then there will be a quick 15-minute presentation, a third one from both of them, and then a 5-minute concluding statements from both. Thank you.
I would like to begin my statement today by thanking Set Free, the Secular Student Alliance, and the Philosophy Club for hosting this debate today. I would like to thank Mr. Barker for coming here to defend the affirmative in our proposition today, and thank the students who are here and the students who will be watching these videos in the future for taking the time to investigate this extremely important subject. And most of all, I'd like to thank my God who saved me through the death and blood of his eternal Son, Jesus Christ, and who has given us his infallible word that we may learn to know him, serve him, and enjoy him forever. I will be responding to Mr. Barker's opening statement in my second speech, which will be coming up after his second one. Our proposition today is that the Old Testament is mainly fiction and not fact. Mr. Barker is affirming this proposition, and I am denying it. Let me define the terms of this proposition. By Old Testament, I mean the 39 canonical books of the Bible in Hebrew. By mainly, Mr. Barker needs to prove that the majority, at least 51%, of the Old Testament is fiction and not fact. while I believe the Old Testament is 100% accurate, and I will argue along those lines, for Mr. Barker to win this debate, he needs to prove not that there is a scribal error in a particular Hebrew manuscript, not that a particular sentence or two is hard for us to understand, but that a majority of the Old Testament is fictional. Furthermore, since Mr. Barker is in the affirmative, he needs to do what he said in his own words in his book Godless, namely that the affirmative, not the negative, in that situation the proponent must make a case beyond a reasonable doubt, which he said in his book Godless on page 104. So he does not just need to cast a certain amount of doubt or demonstrate that it's possible for something to be maybe difficult for us to understand, but he must prove that the majority of the Old Testament is fictional, not factual, to win this debate. By fiction, I have a slide on that, I mean the dictionary definition of, quote, something feigned, invented, or imagined, especially a made-up story. By fact, I mean an event or thing known to have happened beforehand. How do we know the Old Testament is fact, not fiction? There are many lines of evidence in this regard. First, the Bible is an accurate record of past historical events. Indeed, archaeologist Nelson Glueck, who said, it may be stated categorically, and we have a slide for this somewhere, that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Now we have a slide for it if you can get to it. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible. And by the same token, proper evaluation of biblical descriptions has often led to amazing discoveries. They form tesserae, tiles, in the vast mosaic of the Bible's incredibly correct historical memory. Dr. Glueck was the president of the Hebrew Union College, whose pioneering work in biblical archaeology contributed to the discovery of 1,500 ancient sites. He was not some crazy fundamentalist person. He was actually a member of the extremely liberal Reform Judaism movement, which does not hold to inerrancy or anything even close to it. But yet he made this very remarkable statement about the archaeology of the Bible. So that's one thing. Now, I was thinking, how in 20 minutes can I somehow cover the historicity of the whole Bible? That's going to be a difficult thing to do. So what I'm going to try to establish here is that the Bible actually is a record. If the Bible is the Word of God, then of course it's historically accurate in everything that it says. And we're going to look today at some evidence that it would actually be what it claims there. In the book of Isaiah chapter 44, Jehovah says that he is able to predict the future, and because he is able to show the things that are coming and that shall come, that shows that he is the true God. And certainly that would be quite a claim. If somebody can predict specific things about the future, that would be evidence that this might actually be the case. And actually right after that, he predicted the specific name of King Cyrus, who 150 years after Isaiah 44 was written, allowed the Jews to return to Israel and rebuild the temple, which Isaiah 44 predicted and mentioned his name. We're going to look at one particular book here because we have to, we only have limited time to look at some of this evidence that there's actual prophecy, clear, specific, predictive prophecy in the Bible. In the book of Daniel, which is where we're going to be focusing on in my presentation today, there are a number of very clear, specific predictions that were made, predicted things hundreds of years that took place later. For example, in Daniel chapter 2 and 7, if you can get to the slide for that, which we're not going to spend most of our time focusing on, but in Daniel chapter 2 and 7, there's a prediction of 4 different empires. He predicts the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Greek, and Roman Empire. And there's specific things in Daniel's vision of chapter 2 and chapter 7 where these things are discussed. He mentioned specifically, for example, with Babylon, it says in Daniel chapter 2 that the Babylonian king is the head of gold. With the Medo-Persian Empire, it's mentioned in another one of the chapters that the king of the Medes and the Persians is the animal represented there. So there's a prediction in the 6th century of Daniel of 4 successive empires, the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Greek, and Roman Empire. Also in Daniel chapter 11, we get to the slides of that, Daniel from the 6th century to the time of 165 BC has many, many specific predictions about the Greeks and the Persian Empire. And you can go in Daniel chapter 11, you can keep clicking here, so we have in verse 2 of chapter 11, we have, it says in chapter 11 that there shall stand, this by the way, this was written in the first year of the Persian domination after the Babylonian Empire has kind of come to an end here. And that's the context there. And it says, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, Daniel 11 predicts. And those 3 kings were Cambyses, Pseudo-Smyrtus, and Darius the first. Then it says in Daniel 11, the 4th shall be far richer than they all. That's Xerxes the first. He shall stir up against the realm of Grecia, it says there. And he assaulted Greece in 480 BC. Next slide. Daniel 11:3-4 then says, and a mighty king shall stand up. That's Alexander the Great. It says, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven and not to his posterity. Alexander died in 323 BC, and his kingdom was divided, not to his sons, but to his four generals. Ptolemy over Egypt in the south, Seleucus over Syria in the north, Cassander over Macedonia and Greece in the east, and Lysimachus over Thrace and portions of Asia Minor in the west. Then verse 5 says, Daniel here writing in the first year of the Persian domination says, and the king of the south shall be strong. And this next portion of Daniel chapter 11, he starts to focus upon the two nations that are on both sides of Israel. On the north, the Syrians, and on the south, Egypt. Egypt is called the king of the south, and the Syrians are called the king of the north. And Daniel chapter 11 and verse 5 says that the king of the south will be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him. And the northern king, Seleucus the first, was stronger than the king of the south, Ptolemy, and he gained control of the area from Asia Minor to India. And then Daniel 11 and verse 6 predicts, it says, and in the end of the years, after a period of time, they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. And the successors of Egypt there, and Ptolemy II Philadelphus gave his daughter in marriage to the Syrian successor, Antiochus II Theos, around 252 BC. And Antiochus divorced his wife to make this union take place. But then it says, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm. And the first wife, who the guy divorced to marry the other lady, murdered Antiochus, his wife, and their infant son. So that kind of bad situation there, but it fits with the verse there. And then you go to the next slide there. And then in 11:7-9, it says, out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate. That's Ptolemy III. He was the successor king. It says, he shall come with an army and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north and shall deal against them and shall prevail. And that's exactly what he did. He went and he was able to gain victories over the Syrian armies and took a lot of the territory back again. You go to the next slide. In chapter 11, 10:11, it says, but his sons shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. And Syrian sons, Seleucus and Antiochus the Great, they continued the war with Egypt. And it says, the king of the south shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. But the multitude shall be given into his hand. And Antiochus recovered Syria and Israel from Egyptian dominion, and happened just like Daniel had predicted. Verses 12-16 go on to say, predict the battles of Egypt and Syria over Israel. It says, and in those times many shall stand up against the king of the south. And he had Antiochus the Great, Philip, king of Macedon, and other people were opposing them in Egypt there. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. And the glorious land, from Daniel's perspective, was the nation of Israel, which was consumed by these marauding armies that were coming in. And you can go to the next slide. And there we see that at that time, the words aren't there. Oh, there they come. Okay, good. He shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither for him. And so Antiochus, seeking an alliance with Egypt, arranged the marriage of his daughter Cleopatra with Ptolemy Epiphanes in 193 BC. But Cleopatra did not favor her father nor stand on his side. Instead, she favored her husband and what was going on with them. It goes on in Daniel 11, continuing there in that passage. It says that, he shall turn his face to the isles, but he shall stumble and fall. So he's coming again against the Romans. He was defeated by the Romans there. And then shall stand up in his estate, a raiser of taxes in the glory of his kingdom. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. And the successor to Antiochus there, he did indeed raise the taxes there, and he sought the riches of the temple in Israel. And he did not die in battle nor in anger. He probably was poisoned, so he didn't die through like a tumult or a battle. You go to the next slide. Then Antiochus IV Epiphanes is the one who is focused upon mainly in this passage, because he was the one who brought the most trouble to Israel in that he tried to end the Jewish worship entirely. And it says, in his estate shall stand up a vile person, Antiochus, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And so the proper heir was actually he eliminated the proper heir, and he took the kingdom in a way that was not as legitimate heir there. And you can go to the next slide. And then he made, after his league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And he did indeed, he made a covenant of peace with the Egyptians. He used that to go in and plunder Egypt, and he started a war there. And then they tried to make this peace treaty. Both the Egyptians and the northern kingdom spoke lies at one table. They tried to negotiate something, and they were both lying about that. You can keep going to the next slide. And it says, then shall he return to his land with great riches. He took great riches from Egypt. That's exactly what happened. And his heart shall be against the holy covenant. And what he did after he came back out of that land is he ended up having the high priest Onias III assassinated, or he was at least supportive of that. And he ended up trying to eliminate the Jewish religion entirely, which ended up causing a revolt that began the Maccabean Revolution. You can go back to the previous slide for a second. And when he was in Egypt, it says there the ships of Kittim will come against him. And that's actually the Romans who came from that land. And they told him he needed to get out of Egypt because if he doesn't get out of Egypt, they were going to fight with him. So he did that because he didn't want to fight the Romans. So there, again, another thing predicted there by Daniel. You go to the next slide. And it says what he did then in 165 BC is he polluted the sanctuary, he took away the daily sacrifice, and put in place the abomination that maketh desolate. In other words, he shut the temple down. He sacrificed an unclean animal on the altar, and that was not a good situation for the Jews. And it says then also he tried to get everyone to stop worshiping the God of Israel. Those people that did wickedly against the covenant, he tried to get them on his side, the people who didn't really care about the Jewish law. Go to the next slide. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword. They shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And here we have the beginning of the Maccabean revolt, where the people that actually cared about the God of Israel decided to stand up, and they were fighting against this, and many of them got killed. Then when it seemed like they were starting to get victory, then many people ended up cleaving to them with flatteries, and they ended up taking over. There's more that could be said about that. I have in the back a 70-page discussion of the book of Daniel as evidence for the Bible as the Word of God, but I have limited time here, so, what can you do? You have to cover what you can cover. I think that hopefully that's pretty clear. There's some pretty specific, pretty detailed predictions in Daniel. Those would be good if it was just history, but it's not history. It's something that was written hundreds of years beforehand, and that would seem to be impossible without God. And if God is a truthful God, then he can definitely predict the future, and we can count on the Bible being reliable. You go to the next slide. Also in Daniel, so there's approximately 135 digital prophetic statements in Daniel 11, 1-35, and every single one of them was fulfilled and historically confirmed. Go to the next slide, please. Daniel chapter 9 also predicts the specific day and time that the Messiah would come under the Romans. You can go to the next slide here. It says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision of prophecy, and to note the most holy. And so the 70 weeks there are weeks of years. You can see that for a number of indications in the context. Chapter 10 and verse 2 and 3 contrast these weeks of years with normal weeks. The word week just means 7. The word is used in the Mishnah of weeks of years specifically. And so we can see that there. The weeks, the years that are talked about are 360-day years. Those 360, they didn't have a calendar just like our modern calendar. The Jewish calendar was 360 days. That was also the case with the land where this prediction was made. The Persians had one, the Babylonians had one, so it was actually also fitting the context where the prophecy was made. And actually, if you look at the interpretation of the 70 weeks prophecy, they were actually expecting the Essenes, the Pharisees, the different groups at the time were actually looking for this to happen around the time that it actually took place because they were interpreting Daniel chapter 9. Go to the next slide, please. So this is actually what's going on with the prophecy. It says, there's a little slide there. There's 69 weeks till the Messiah being cut off. And then the 70th week, there's a gap actually in the passage, and then you have the 70th week in the future. Go to the next slide, please. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. 60 means 60, score is 20. So 69 weeks total. The street shall be built again and the wall even in troublous times. And after that, those first 7 weeks of years, 49 years, they did indeed rebuild Jerusalem. And then after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And so after the 69th week, the Messiah will be cut off, which is a term for death under the curse of God. But he didn't die for himself. He died a substitutionary death. And then the people of the prince that shall come, which would be the Romans, would destroy the city and the sanctuary. And that was what happened to Jerusalem in AD 70. And we can see this. So now all we need to do is figure out when this decree was issued and when it comes to an end. The decree was issued on March 5th, 444 BC. That was the day when Nehemiah, it's recorded there, that the decree was issued to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. We can figure out the date of that decree from a number of historical sources. And you go forward, you just make the calculation there, 483 360-day years, and you change that to solar years. You go forward that number of years, and lo and behold, it comes out to AD 33. So the book of Daniel predicted that the Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself, in AD 33. And actually, what's even more amazing, if you actually figure out the number of days, exactly, it actually comes out not just to the exact year, but to the exact day that Christ presented himself riding in on the donkey as the Messiah in Zechariah chapter 9. And that is why, if you go to the slide of, so there's a donkey there. If you go to, and there were donkeys in the Bible, see? If you go to Luke chapter 19, and the next slide, when actually this specific day was going to take place, Christ actually wept over the city of Jerusalem. Next slide. And he said, "If thou hadst known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, but now they are hid from thine eyes." Because he knew this was the exact day upon which the 69 weeks prophecy was going to come to an end. And then he predicts, just like Daniel 9 said the city and the sanctuary would be destroyed, he then says that the day shall come that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, compass thee round, keep thee in on every side, and lay thee even with the ground. And so he predicts that Jerusalem will be destroyed, which is exactly what Daniel 9 said was going to happen. Next slide, please. And so then we also see that not only was the specific day of the Messiah's coming predicted in Daniel chapter 9, but also we have a statement that the Romans, the people, the prince that shall come, the fourth empire of Daniel chapter 2 and 7, will destroy the city, which happened in AD chapter 70. That only happened, the only times the city of Jerusalem was destroyed was 586 BC, if I remember correctly, when the exile happened, and then 70 AD. You go to the next slide, please. And then the last week is actually a future thing. You can see that it says in Daniel 9 there that it says after the 69 weeks, then there's a gap clearly in the passage. So then we have the future week, which is going to happen in the future. Go to the next slide. The writings of Confucius, Buddha, Mohammed, Joseph Smith, Nostradamus, and all Western philosophers and Eastern teachers do not have anything like the specific, detailed, clear, predictive prophecies of the Bible, which would be a good reason to think that it would actually be accurate and from God. Now, maybe you can say, well, maybe these predictions of Daniel are somehow changed. Maybe they put them in later and something happened there and it was kind of put in afterwards. Well, that is not a reasonable thing to conclude. We have over 6,000 manuscripts of the Old Testament. We have over 5,500 New Testament ones. We have no other document that even comes close to the number of manuscripts we have of the Bible. So if we can't count on the Bible being reliable, we can't count on anything in history. Nothing. We don't know anything at all, because if this is not enough evidence, then really what could we have in terms of evidence? So it's not reasonable to think that it has been changed. Go to the next slide, please. You go to the next one after that. And so then how do we know? Maybe Daniel wasn't written in the 6th century. Maybe it was written later. We're going to get as far as we can here, and when he tells me to stop, I'm going to stop. So the book of Daniel, how do we know that Daniel wrote it in the 6th century? Well, we know it from a number of reasons. First of all, he claims to have written it. He says, different things in there, claiming to have written the book, so that's at least, that's something. Go to the next slide, please. Also, it's not pseudonymous. We know that because, first of all, there's no clear evidence of pseudonymity in the Old Testament and much clear evidence against it. You actually, in Israel, you would get executed if you tried to come up with something like that. And not only was a pseudonymity not accepted in Israel, even it wasn't accepted in the cultures around it. In the Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, they actually would give you heavy punishments if you did something like that. So at least they, that wasn't accepted. Next slide, please. Also, all the Jews, there's no evidence that any Jew questioned Daniel's authorship in the 6th century from the time of its composition until the modern era. So the Jews all thought that it was Daniel the whole time. They thought that. Josephus, actually, the early Jewish historian, described Daniel as one of the greatest of the prophets. Josephus actually records when Alexander the Great came into the city of Jerusalem in the 300s BC, and the high priest Jaddua brought the book of Daniel to him and said, look, this book predicts that you're going to come and destroy the Persians, and of course Alexander the Great liked that, and so he gave a special privilege to the Jews. So here, Josephus records that somehow before the book was even written, according to an anti-supernatural view. Am I up? Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. You're a very smart guy. You're very articulate, very likable person, and very brave to do this kind of thing. But very beside the point. Our debate tonight is not, is there a God? There might be a God. I'm not arguing for atheism tonight. I'm convinced there's no God, but that's not our debate tonight. The debate tonight is not, there's a God who can issue prophecies that are true. That's not our debate tonight. Our debate is about whether the Old Testament itself is fiction, whether it is historical. I gave you an example of a number of Israeli archaeologists and historians who are convinced that the archaeological record does not support any of the stories of the Old Testament. Tom gave you the name of one who is convinced of the opposite. So there you go. We have competing scholars. You don't have to be an expert to understand that the experts disagree with each other. Surprise, surprise. There are different points of view all over the place. So maybe during his rebuttal, Tom will address some of the issues that I raised. He said that this archaeologist had archaeological proof, but he didn't give any. He didn't offer any for any of the claims that I was talking about. But the reason Tom is totally beside the point with this debate tonight is that the prophecy of Daniel is irrelevant. He admits that it's one of the later books written. He admits there is controversy over the date of the writing. But notice that when Daniel writes, he doesn't mention any names. Supposedly, we're supposed to be impressed that this all-caring, all-knowing, omniscient God of the universe cares about us so much, he loves us so much, that he tells some prophet named Daniel about some events that are going to happen in his lifetime with no names. He didn't mention the name Alexander the Great when he should have. Didn't God know that name? In fact, in Isaiah 7:14 supposedly is a prediction of the birth of Jesus. Why didn't Isaiah say, by the way, his name will be Jesus instead of Emmanuel? Was Jesus ever called Emmanuel? No. That was a mistake. Very mushy, very imprecise. And suppose I agree. I'm not agreeing, but suppose I agree. Yeah, Daniel was a real prophet. How does that make the majority of the Old Testament historically reliable? There might have been some guy who had some great gifts. Wow, that might have been true. I doubt it. I think there's other ways to explain what happened. And Tom even hinted at it, that some of these stories could have been redacted. We know that happened all the time. Jews and Christians were all the time. Even though it was against the law to write pseudonymously, to make plagiarisms, it happened all the time. It was against the law in the first century. But we know that Christians were tampering with their own documents. Paul even admitted it. He said, you'll hear that there are some people writing letters pretending to be from me. So he admitted there were forgeries happening in the first century among Christians. So there were also Israelites and Jews committing forgeries, even in their own time. Scholars disagree about this. But these four empires that Daniel mentions were not even named. And what a thing to, if you had this gift of prophecy, wouldn't you rather use it for something like important? Like, by the way, medicine. By the way, germs. By the way, wash your hands before you eat, because there's these little things called germs. That would be a useful thing, rather than some obscure king somewhere who's going to do something that may or may not have happened at the time in some vague way. Yes, it is pretty amazing when you put some things together. But this fulfilled prophecy thing is a red herring. It's like it's trying to distract you from the fact that the Old Testament stories themselves are not historical, that they have mistakes and anachronisms, that they are outrageous. So it's beside the point. Let's say there was a prophet named Daniel. He was just one writer in the book. And the mistake that a lot of believers make, and I used to make as a Christian minister, was to treat the whole Old Testament and New Testament as if they were one coherent unit, like it was the Word of God, when it's really just a bunch of scattered pieces of books that were later canonized and put together, supposedly under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But when you look at them, you see that some of them had something to say, some of them didn't, some contradicted each other. The New Testament writers contradicted each other a lot. But Tom alluded to a really fatal flaw in this whole Daniel and the 70 weeks prophecy. He admitted that they were doing the calculation with a 360-day year to make it work out. That's 5¼ days off, right? He said that it's possible that they were using that kind of a day back then, but he gave no evidence for that. The reason they use that 360-day year, which is not a good thing to do if you're calculating the future, is because if you use 365¼ it doesn't work. The dates don't work out like you want. You're probably 7 to 10 years off if you use the actual length of a year. But if you use this 360, which is a pretty neat number, by the way, 360 degrees in a circle, it's divisible by so many things, 12 and 5 and 6 and all, and a bunch of numbers. It's kind of a neat number, but the year is not 360 days. It is 365¼ So even right there, he's showing that somebody is monkeying with the numbers to get it to work out pretty close to where you want it to be. And by the way, he even admits that some of the New Testament writers knew about these things. The New Testament writers were writing fiction as well. Matthew, for example, was fond of going through the Old Testament and looking for supposed prophecies, like Isaiah 7:14. Guess what? I found a prophecy of a child, and that's Jesus. He was really sloppy. Matthew was really sloppy. New Testament writers, even some of them might have even known about Daniel and said, oh, wow, let's make it happen right about this time. You don't know that that couldn't have happened. It's pretty sloppy. It didn't mention any of the names, any of the places, any of the events in the life of Jesus. And by the way, another seemingly fatal flaw in this whole 70 weeks prophecy thing is that right at the beginning, it admits that after the 70 weeks will be the end of sin. Did sinning stop during the time of Jesus? Are any of you sinners? Yes, you admit that you are sinners. I'm not a sinner. There's no such thing as sin. That's just a phony concept. But by the way, I like to say that if salvation is the cure, then atheism is the prevention. Just don't be sick in the first place. And even Jesus said that. They who are healthy don't need the doctor, only they who are sick. But right there, the prophecy fails. At the end of 70 weeks was not the end of sin. And then another, on its face, it looks like it's a great argument. 6,000 manuscripts. That has to be true. Do you know how many million copies there are of Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion? Millions of copies in dozens of languages. Does the sheer number of copies make it more truthful? If I were to write my cat story about the black and white cat on a piece of paper and then make copies and copies and send it all over the internet and people forwarded it millions of times, does that make it more true because there are more copies? That's really a non-argument, and it's kind of embarrassing that Josh McDowell does that a lot. The number of manuscripts. Of course, Bart Ehrman shows that there are more contradictions between the manuscripts than there actually are words in the New Testament itself. The manuscripts don't always agree with each other. And I'm sure Tom will agree with you on that. Manuscripts do have differences. He would probably say they don't differ on any major events, but there are differences in the manuscripts. So I think, and Tom was honest enough to say that he will address my remarks during his rebuttal. But I think so far, nothing he has said tonight adds even an iota of evidence towards the claim that the Old Testament as a whole is a historical book. What if I were to grant, all right, there was a real prophet. There really was a real prophet and his name was Daniel. What if I were to admit that? How does that make the Old Testament historical? How? What if in the novels of Stephen King, somebody were to make a prediction of something that came true? Would that mean the whole thing is historical? No. This whole thing about Daniel and fulfilled prophecies, which if you scratch beneath the surface a lot of them, they're not prophecies at all. They're reworked or remade prophecies. So Daniel was late. We don't know the exact date of the authorship. We don't know how much tampering was done with it. But even granting Tom's point about Daniel, which I don't do, but even if we did do it, it doesn't add any evidence or rebuttal to the claim that the Old Testament itself is mainly fiction.
Okay, you can, or 15 minutes, right? Yep, 15 minutes. Yep. 10, oh, thank you, 10 minutes. Ooh. Okay, I'm just going to continue a little bit because some of the things that he brought up were actually addressed in parts of my presentation I haven't got to yet. We mentioned that all Jews, as far as we can tell until the modern era, believed Daniel was the author of his book, so they seem to think it was actually written by him in the 6th century. All Christians did as well. There's no evidence that any Christian questioned Daniel's authorship until modern times. Christ said that Daniel the prophet wrote it. So my point with all this is that modern authors who say that Daniel did not write it in the 6th century are actually going upon no evidence at all. There's absolutely no evidence of anybody who lived back then who said that he didn't. So we have to say that people who lived in the 20th century knew more about what happened back then than people who were living back then. All of them. So, and I guess maybe that's possible, but it doesn't seem super likely. Furthermore, to make the prophecies sort of happen after the fact is not possible. For example, Ezekiel quotes Daniel in the 6th century. Daniel was his contemporary. He refers specifically to Daniel in the 6th century as a real historical person. If you go to the next slide for a second where we have the quotes, it says there in the book of Ezekiel, these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it. They should deliver but their own souls by their righteousness, saith the Lord God. So here Daniel is given as an example of a righteous person, an extremely righteous person, is well known for that, and Ezekiel is his contemporary. Also, Ezekiel 28 and verse 3, behold, thou art wiser than Daniel, he says to the king of Tyre. Tyre was being very proud and so on. And so here we have a reference to the wisdom of Daniel, which is actually alluding to Daniel chapter 1 and verse 17 in all likelihood. So we have a specific allusion to the book of Daniel in the 6th century, which is not possible if it actually wasn't written until 400 years later. You can go back to the previous slide again, please. So that, no, other way. So also we have other references. The book of Tobit. Tobit is an apocryphal book which was written in the 3rd century BC, which is before 165 when you have to date these things. Tobit has verbal allusions to Daniel. The book of Watchers, the first part of the pseudepigraphical book of Enoch, is also dated the 3rd century BC. And it also has clear references in it to the book of Daniel. Also, the Hellenistic Jewish historian Demetrius in the 3rd century BC has already drawn up a chronology of Daniel chapter 9. So here he's drawing up a chronology in Daniel chapter 9 of a book that has not yet been written. I don't know, I can't do that. That'd be a miracle, for sure. All right? Also, the book of Ecclesiasticus has clear references to Daniel. It contains a prayer that the prophecies of Daniel would be fulfilled soon. Yet this was written before the time that the predictions would have to have taken place. First Maccabees, which is recognized, it's not inspired, but it's a reliable historical document, records the prayer of Matthias on his deathbed. He counseled his sons to emulate the example of, quote, Daniel, who for his innocency was delivered from the mouth of lions, and the example of his 3 Hebrew friends, who because of their faith were saved from fire. So Matthias, though, died before the time that anti-supernaturalists say the book of Daniel was written. So how can he do that if it wasn't written yet? And he's referring to this. 3rd Maccabees is the same thing. So we have clear references to that. Furthermore, the early, you can go to the next slide now. There one. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have very early copies of Daniel. In terms of it being changed or whatever, we have actual clear, if Richard Dawkins' book was millions of copies, you wouldn't be able to change it either, okay? I concede, Richard Dawkins' book was not changed with the millions of copies. And neither was Daniel, because of all the copies of it, okay? The book of Daniel here, we have in Qumran, it's the same text as in your modern Hebrew Bible that you have in your hand. And we have copies of it that are very early. The scholars have said that the early date of the copies of Daniel that we found at Qumran make the late date highly problematic. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Septuagint, according to the letter of Aristeas, was translated in the 3rd century BC. Now, that again is before the date that anti-supernaturalists have to say the book was written. And the letter of Aristeas says the whole Septuagint was translated. It even refers to earlier translations that were made at the time. Now, I'm not saying that the letter of Aristeas is inspired or perfect, but at least what I am saying is that the actual extant evidence that we have dates Daniel to before the time that you have to say it was written on anti-supernaturalist dating presuppositions. Furthermore, and that was also recognized by later commentators on the LXX. They all say that it was translated before this time. Also, we have 6th century Hebrew and Aramaic in Daniel. The Hebrew of Daniel fits with the period of Daniel. The Chaldee or Aramaic excludes any later period. You can't just forge a 6th century document several centuries later very easily. Imagine if I was going to pretend to write a play of Shakespeare. And I not only was going to forge a play of Shakespeare, but I was also going to do it somehow without any really copies of stuff from the time. That'd be very, very difficult to do. I would reveal my later date in different anachronistic things. But Daniel's Hebrew and Aramaic fit the time extremely well. In fact, when it was translated into LXX, some of the Hebrew was so archaic that they didn't know what it meant already, which shows that it's also early. Next slide, please. Also, in terms of is there history in here? So we have specific prophecies, and is there history in here as well? Well, for example, Belshazzar in the 19th century, critics similar to Mr. Barker were saying that he was not a historical person. He was a myth. But in 1854, we found the Nabonidus cylinder at Ur, which had the specific name of Belshazzar. It verified that he was exactly what the Bible in the book of Daniel said he was. He was in that position over the kingdom, while Nabonidus, who was the guy over him, was actually in the Arabian desert worshiping a god Sin, which is kind of an interesting thing. I'm not making any argument out of that, okay? But he was worshiping this idol named Sin in the desert. And you go to the next slide there, please. Also, Darius the Mede was considered to be a non-historical figure, but now we actually have clear evidence that he was a historical person. He was not confused with Darius I. He was actually the governor of Babylon for a while. The book of Daniel mentions, people say that Daniel 1:1 says that it was the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar came. Jeremiah 25 says it was the 4th year. So is this an error here, 3rd year, 4th year? Well, actually, the Babylonians dated the year of the king's reign differently than they would in Judah. They dated the first year of a king's reign from, if he took reign in the middle of the year, the next year was when he started. And so the Judeans would count from the back, they'd go the other way. So actually that dating system is not inaccuracy. It actually evidences that somehow Daniel is using an archaic 6th century Babylonian dating system when supposedly it was written hundreds of years later. Next slide, please. Nebuchadnezzar. The book of Daniel mentions that Nebuchadnezzar was the builder of Babylon. He was the one who built the whole area. That is not something that's mentioned in any extant Greek historian or whatever. So how did Daniel know this in the 2nd century, supposedly, if it was written back then instead of centuries earlier? This would be very difficult. Also, Shushan, the province is mentioned, and the province was different in the 2nd century. It mentions a specific province. It uses a Babylonian numbering system. Daniel 5:5 mentions that the Babylonian palace walls were plastered, which has actually been confirmed. We've dug up the palace walls, and they have plaster on them. So somehow he knew what the walls were like several centuries later. Daniel mentions the differences between specific Babylonian and Persian customs. There's different references to the Chaldeans as what they were. Next slide, please. Babylonian names. Daniel's 3 friends are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You can actually find these names attested as high court officials on a clay prism found in Babylon, mentioning about Nebuchadnezzar's government in 593 BC. You can look them up, and you can read the document. I did before I came in here because I wanted to make sure I wasn't making something up. They're right there. You can read their names. And somehow, in the 2nd century, he knew the names of these people, the specific officials of Babylon, centuries earlier. Next slide, please. Daniel also predates the split of the Essenes from the Pharisees and Sadducees. Both groups accepted the book of Daniel. That split happened before the time that supposedly the book was made up. Ancient historical parallels support prophets writing their predictions down right away. There's no evidence of the time for these sort of late, making it up later. So the Maccabean date is not based upon anything real. It's just based upon the anti-supernatural presupposition. It's not something that actually is accurate. After 160 years of Greek rule, there are only 3 Greek words in Daniel. There are specific ones for musical instruments. Would be very surprising if it was actually the case if they were there for 160 years already. I'll also point out that he said that there were no mentions of specific kingdoms of any kind in the book of Daniel, in the prophecies of the 4 kings. Oh, my computer isn't turning on now. Oh, there we go. Okay. Daniel 8:20. The ram which thou sawest having 2 horns are the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, that sounds like something. Daniel 10:20. Then said he, knowest thou wherefore I come unto thee? And now will I return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I am gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia will come. That sounds like a company there, And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, they shall stand against 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength through riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. I think if you're honest, you look at Daniel chapter 11, you look at the prophecies there, it's a very specific thing. And the fact is, if there are actual prophecies in the Bible, this would be evidence that God actually gave it to us, and then we could consider the whole thing accurate. In terms of 360-day years, ancient India, ancient Persia, Babylonia, Assyria, Egypt, they all had 360-day years. So he can deny that if he wants to. You can investigate that on your own. They did. So saying that nobody had 360-day years is simply not accurate. If you compare Genesis 7:24 and 8:3, it mentions that the flood was 5 months long, and the flood was 150 days long. 30-day months, 360-day years. So I think that also is simply not a good thing to conclude. And I'd like to know also... Time. Thank you.
Next part is the cross-examination, which is going to be a back and forth, a 10-minute total event. If I can have both of you up front.
So I guess I get to ask you as many questions as I can for 5 minutes.
Go right ahead.
And you answer as briefly as possible, and I'll try to do the same thing so we can get as many of them in. So when did the Exodus happen?
I believe that it happened in 1446 BC, though some scholars think it happened in the 13th century, but in either case, it was a definite historical event.
What language was written on the tablets of stone on the 10 Commandments?
I believe it was written in Hebrew.
Hebrew?
Yes, sir.
In what year did that happen?
I believe it was 1446 BC.
1446 BC.
Yes, sir.
God wrote it with his finger on the tablets in Hebrew.
Yes, sir. Since I believe that miracles are possible, I believe that it is possible for things that don't fit into your worldview to happen.
Well, it has nothing to do with my worldview. Are you aware of the fact that there was no Hebrew language in 1446 BC, that the Hebrew language did not originate until the 10th century? There was no Hebrew alphabet until about the 10th century. Are you aware of that historical, archaeological fact?
That is simply false. That is not true.
Do you have any evidence that Hebrew language was being written and spoken before the 10th century BC?
I can get you some. I can't like pull up a chart or something, but there is evidence that the Hebrew language did exist at that time.
There was.
Yes, sir.
Well, everything I read said there was not. The Hebrew language was not a dialect, a Semitic dialect, until the 10th century BC. So there's no way. Of course, I'm supposed to ask you questions.
Yeah, that's right.
So where are the Ten Commandments? I mean, this is supposedly God's important. Moses went up to this mountain out in the Sinai Peninsula that was smoking and squeaking and screaming, and people couldn't see him. And then he came down with the second set that he came down with. So where are they?
I got a copy on my computer here. I got a copy.
Where are the physical stones?
I don't know where the physical stones are.
You don't know.
No, I don't.
So is there any evidence to confirm that those stones were written in Hebrew?
Well, one thing I would say is that the book, the Pentateuch, is in the form of a suzerain vassal treaty, which is a treaty format that only existed around the time that Moses was supposed to have come out of Egypt. It did not exist several centuries later on the late date assumption. So actually, if you look at the treaty format, some scholars have said that if we didn't have somebody like Moses, we'd have to assume that there was a person like that to make the document look like it did.
Yeah, that seems historical. It seems like you would need people to make up lies even. I mean, you need human beings to do that. So
what I'm saying, though, is that sorry, go ahead. It looks like a 14th century document, though.
So who was the Pharaoh in the Exodus story?
I think it was Amenhotep III, but some people say it was Ramses II, but he was a historical pharaoh, yes.
So you're aware of the fact that the Israelite stories mention all these kings by name. By the way, Daniel didn't mention names. He just said Greece and Persia. He didn't mention names of the people, and he knew about Greece. But you're aware of the fact that the Israelites mentioned, here was this king by this name, here was this king by that name. Why didn't, for historical reasons, why didn't the writer of the Pentateuch mention the name of the Pharaoh of Egypt?
Because he just didn't write it down. I mean, why don't you mention many names of people in your books? I mean, that doesn't mean he's not a historical person because he didn't say this is the guy's name.
Tell me, why did the Israelites have to take this long roundabout way to get to the Sinai Peninsula when there was a shorter route to get there, instead of going all the way south to cross the Red Sea? Why?
Because there were Egyptian garrisons in the northern route, which is historically verifiable, so they actually couldn't have gone through without having had war, which is why also the Bible says that they went the southern route to avoid the war.
Really?
Yes,
God
sir.
wanted to avoid a war. The God of war, who equipped his warriors with military finesse, who invaded and conquered the Canaan in the Promised Land, these brave Israelite warriors who were chased by this Pharaoh, nameless Pharaoh, this God was not powerful enough to let them break through a few garrisons at the border?
It wasn't a matter of power, but if I was a bunch of slaves that it wasn't used to fighting, I would probably like to get some time before I had to fight Egyptian garrisons. And there were Egyptian garrisons there.
So you admit they took a roundabout way?
Yeah, of course they took a roundabout way.
To get across.
It took them 40 years. That's pretty roundabout.
Get across the sea. 40 years it took them to go 130 miles.
Well, they weren't traveling the whole time. They were stationed in various places for a long time. But I'm just saying, certainly they weren't aiming for speed.
Do you know how
it wasn't
many,
like Uber or something.
You know how many people there were that were traveling there?
The Bible says 603,000 men.
And 559.
And 559. Okay.
603,559.
Yes. On the assumption that the word thousand, I think that is the actual number. There are some scholars who say that the word thousand is referring to bands, in which case you could have a smaller number. But in either case, it definitely happened. I think it's thousands. But even if you said it was just bands, it would still actually, because the word thousand can be translated that way, it would still actually be a historical event.
So the total number of people would have been 2 or 3 million people. With
on the
wives
assumption
and
of 603,000, yes.
Plus all their livestock.
Yes, on the assumption
Plus
that
all
that
their
number's right.
tents that they had one day to put together, right? So they somehow in one day, 3 million people got across. You believe that is a historical fact?
Yes.
All right. Reset the clock. Mr. Ross, you have the floor.
Don't start until my computer turns on.
Try turning it on and off again.
I don't want to do that. There we go.
Pray for it.
Yeah.
It worked.
Turned on, yeah, there we go.
It's a miracle.
Right. Mr. Barker, I'm looking on page 640 of On the Reliability of the Old Testament by K.A. Kitchen. Are those pictures of camels? Is that a picture of a camel at Ur? Is that a picture of a camel at Byblos in the 2nd millennium? Is that a picture of a camel in the early 2nd millennium in Syria? Is that a picture of a camel in Egypt in the 13th century BC? Is that a picture of camel at By-Ramses on a plot in the 13th century BC?
Maybe, but let me answer your question. I did not say there were no camels before that time.
Oh, okay.
There were camels. There were camels millions of years ago. And there were camels in that part of the world,
Oh, okay.
even before that time.
Okay.
The question is, were there domesticated camels that were being used for caravans and beasts of burden? And you probably saw the article in Tel Aviv magazine.
Is that a pot on the camel that it's carrying?
I don't know what that is. That
Looks like a pot.
scribble to me, but whatever it
Okay.
is.
It says loaded camel figure, and there's a slot for the hump and the load for the camel to carry. That camel is from Ur, the Chaldees, which is where Abram is from. Those look like camels to me. So I don't know about
Those are
that camel thing.
drawings. Do you know the dates of those drawings? But in any
Yes,
event,
this is 19th, 18th century BC. This is early 2nd millennium. This one is early 2nd millennium. 13th century BC. This is actually where the Israelites were, Pi-Ramses, 13th century BC.
doesn't that look like it's a broken part and somebody just penciled in that little part in the middle? Doesn't that look like?
Okay, I'm done with that. If you want to say they're not
Look at
camels,
it.
that's
Look
fine.
at the
You can say
picture.
they're not camels. I encourage...
He's got a piece of a potsherd where there's part of an animal and someone drew in
Okay.
the hump.
No problem, that's
That
fine.
hump is not in there, is it?
Do we have an ostracon that refers to the Apiru engaged in construction work at the city of Pi-Ramses?
Apiru, we do, but there's scholarly debate about whether Apiru is a cognate of the word Hebrew. Some people say yes, some people say no. There were Israelites in the area. There were Israelites at the time. There might have been some small bands, but there's no evidence that there was 3 million Israelite slaves in Egypt at the time.
Do quail migrate through the Sinai Peninsula twice a year?
I don't know.
If they do, would that support the possibility of there being quail at the time there?
It would support the possibility, yeah.
Okay.
But 30 trillion stacked up
Does the Bible
to the
say
waist.
30 trillion?
The Bible says that the number of quail was up to 2 cubits high in a circle, a day's walk outside of the
Could
camp.
the quail have been circling around so they had to hit them instead of being...
It says they fell to the ground.
Yeah.
And they fell to the ground in a stack that was 2 cubits high, which
It
is
says a
about
stack
here.
2 cubits high.
Yes, they were in a pile, which
What's
was
the
in
verse
a
that says
pile
stack?
that it was in a pile that went all the way across a day's journey on both sides.
I'd like to see the verse that says stack.
Well, I don't have it right here in front of
Yeah,
me,
there is no- the
but
verse
they
says stack.
they fell to the ground to a height of 2 cubits.
Do you believe in the JEDP theory for the Pentateuch?
I think that's a viable idea. The documentary hypothesis, I think, is very strong among many, because you can obviously see Yahweh by some writers, and you can see
Are there any
Elohim.
manuscripts of J? Okay, have we found any manuscripts of J?
I don't think we have.
Have we found any manuscripts of E?
It depends how old is the manuscript. We have manuscripts.
Of
but yeah.
E? Really?
I don't know if we have
No,
any
we have
actual-
none. Zippo. Do we have any manuscripts of D?
It's a hypothesis.
Do we have
right?
any manuscripts of P?
Well, no, we don't. But you are aware of the fact that the documentary hypothesis hypothesizes that those manuscripts are there because of the literary
So it's kind of
criticism.
a faith. Yeah, in other words, they hypothesize those manuscripts are there because if you assume miracles are impossible, you can't admit Moses wrote it. That's why they assume those manuscripts are there. There's no evidence at all for JEDP.
I think that, to answer your question, I think that's an unwarranted ad hominem accusation. Historians are not anti-supernaturalistic. And if you have to stoop to ad hominem to make your case and accuse people of having a bias, that shows a little bit of desperation. But no one claims that the documentary hypothesis has found those original documents. The documentary hypothesis assumes that, look at, here we have this writing style from this one, but this writing style only uses this word for God, and this one, and the priestly, the P documents only use this word.
You said
so
you
it's a
said
good
you'd answer
hypothesis.
briefly. Are there any? How come nobody until the 19th century realized that there were really these sources in there that aren't there totally reasonable explanations of the text without assuming those sources are there?
It's called literary criticism, and you do it with all branches of literature. You do it with all branches of. You can see influences from one group to another. You can see influences from one type of people to another. You can see differences in languages. So I'm saying that the likelihood of the documentary hypothesis being true is very high. It's not 100%. There might be other things that come to knowledge, but it makes perfectly good literary critical sense to assume that there were different documents that were pieced together later into
Now,
what we call the Pentateuch.
When those documents were supposed to have been written, the suzerain vassal treaty format, which was what the Pentateuch was written in, had not existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. How did those different documentary sources figure out that the Pentateuch was in a suzerain vassal treaty format?
I don't know.
Thank you.
The next part is going to be a simple 10-minute break. However, there can be questions asked of the debaters. Do we have at this time questions picked? All right. This is during the...
Okay, whatever. I'm just going to grab my water then.
Okay. Oh, kind. If you wish to leave for a bathroom break, etc., you may leave at this time. It will be just a simple 10-minute break in which questions will be asked. Thank you.
I don't want to hear too many lectures and talks, but did you notice, just for the record, we're doing a debate with opening statements and then rebuttals. Did you notice that Tom did not rebut my opening statement? Did you notice that? Did you notice that when I got up to rebut, I rebutted his opening statement? He claimed he was going to rebut my opening statement during his rebuttal, but did not. He just went on with more of the same. So as a debate point, he blew it on that one point. What he was really rebutting was his own rebuttal, basically, or he's rebutting my rebuttal. He admitted, by the way, that this 360-day year is what they used, and I've heard about that as well, but even if that's true, 360 is wrong. How many days are there in a year? 0.24 and whatever. Yeah, close enough. I did a debate in Bellevue, Washington on February 29th, 2000. And you know what's significant about that? I debated Phil Fernandez. That was one of the century years that you do have the leap year every 4 years rather than you don't to make the calendar work out. 360 is wrong. Using that number to count the days to Jesus is a mistake. It's wrong. It's bad history. It's special pleading. It's monkeying with numbers. The biblical writers were fond of monkeying with numbers, and they were fond of tampering with things. So Matthew especially, I think Matthew is the worst. Luke was better. I think Luke was a little bit better writer. Now notice that my original thesis did not say there's no history in the Bible. I did not say that. Remember when I talked about Stephen King? There was a Los Angeles. Wow, there was a Central Park in New York City, right? So you could prove that those places actually existed, right? Am I right? Does that mean Stephen King's book, The Stand, is historical? Who thinks it is? So you can see that this is a red herring. This is a non-argument he's using to say, look at, archaeologists have shown that that city did exist. No one's claiming that there's no history in the Old Testament. Obviously, there's some history in it, right? But it's historical fiction. There's a difference between historical fiction and fictionalized history. Historical fiction is some story that wasn't true, but then you dress it up with historical facts, like Stephen King's writings. It's not a true story, but you put it in a historical setting. The writers of the Old Testament did that. They had these untrue stories that were based on previous mythologies, and then they dressed them up in a historical setting. That's called historical fiction. That means the New Old Testament is fictional. Fictional history is different. Fictional history is where you start with an actual historical person, but then you fictionalize their life. Like what was that silly movie about Abraham Lincoln and the zombies? Yeah, so that wasn't a true story, was it? But there was an Abraham Lincoln, right? So that's more like legend, and historical fiction is more like myth. The Old Testament is more like myth. That does not mean, and please don't misunderstand me, that does not mean there's no history or no truth in the Old Testament. There is some. There's history and truth in the writings of Stephen King. It's there, right? But on balance, the story is mainly fictional. It's not true. Those of you who believe it have been misled. You have been lied to. You've swallowed this lie, just like if it was the Greek mythology, just like if it were the Persian mythology. My Native American tribe, my dad's an American Indian, the Lenape tribe. We're called the Delaware Indians by the government. We're a really smart tribe of Indians. We're the tribe that sold Manhattan to the Dutch for $24. Boy, that's really smart. And we had 7 migrations, finally ending up in Oklahoma. But we have some stories about our foundational myths. In fact, Canal Street in Manhattan right now used to be a river. It was the Manetta River that was made into a canal, then made into a street. The Manetta River is where our hero, our ancient hero, Nanabush, conquered the snake Manetta and drove that snake underground into the Manetta River. And it was a great time in our history. That Manhattan Island is our promised land, our religion, our God. By the way, there were Native Americans. Our tribe was on this continent at least 12,000 years ago, if not 15,000 years ago, which, if you think about it, was 9,000 years before the world was created, if you're a young earth creationist. We had these stories long before the Israelites came on the scene. The Israelites are newcomers. There were all these myths and stuff happening before they came along, and it's very clear that they swapped, they borrowed, they interpolated, they rewrote things, just like the Broadway musical West Side Story. Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim admit that West Side Story was based on Romeo and Juliet. It's the same story, but they modernized it. They brought it up into the future. So if you look about it, instead of the Jets and the Sharks and the Capulets and the Montagues, you can see that they were rewriting an older template. The Israelites did the same thing. There's hardly anything in their stories that did not exist in mythical stories before that time. All of those stories were cut, not directly borrowed. West Side Story is not a copy of Romeo and Juliet, but you can see the template, you can see the pattern. And in the Old Testament, you can see the patterns, you can see the templates. If you look at the whole picture, Christians are always telling me I should look at it in context, then I'll understand it. Well, do that. Look at the context. Look at the time of history in which these stories were written down. They're not special. They're not unique. They're just as outrageous and just as crazy as any other mythologies. Tom asked whether 21st century historians would know more than the ancient writers knew. Well, yes, they often do. Often historians know more because the ancient writers had anachronisms, which I pointed to, which Tom did not rebut, by the way, tonight. And maybe he will get to some of that. But often modern historians can look back and see, they can see the mistakes that those ancient writers made when they were assuming things about their own history that were wrong because they were writing. In fact, much of the Bible is not even pretended to be history. It's supposed to be a tale of salvation and sin and obedience to this war god who's so jealous. By the way, did you know you know what name God called himself in the Bible? He said, my name is what? No. He said, my name is. When he said my name is in Exodus 34, what was his name? You should know this. If you believe in it, you should know what the name of God is. My name is jealous. That's what he said. Look it up in Exodus 34. I am the Lord your God whose name is jealous. The Lord jealous. He's fiercely jealous, like a controlling husband over his wife, the Israelites, that he needs to love, and they need to love him. Otherwise, if they don't, he's going to kill them. He's going to massacre them. He's going to make them eat their children. If you look through the Bible, it's horrible. This is the kind of stuff of ancient mythology. And he commands filicide. He accepted the filicide of Jephthah's daughter and then rewarded Jephthah for his burning his own daughter as a sacrifice to God. He needs blood in order for sins to be atoned. Actual blood. He needs blood. He needs something to die. So this looks like ancient mythology. A God of the universe who can do anything he wants has to kill animals? When they were out in the Sinai Peninsula for those 40 years wandering out, imagine that, 3 million people. How many tents is that? How much land is that? How much grazing land would those cattle need? There was one story in there where they sacrificed 240,000 lambs, which means there were a lot more sheep and cattle than that. 240,000 lambs, and yet they needed manna from heaven. So what did they graze? Scholars have predicted that in order to have that, to support that kind of a group, you would have to have grazing land about the size of Rhode Island. It's just a crazy story. This 3 million people, picture how big that is, and they can't go 130 miles in 40 years. You and I could walk it in about a day and a half. It should be like walking over to the Minnesota border. If you walk nonstop pretty quick, you could do that. Took them 40 years because they were scared of the giants. Doesn't that sound like mythology? And by the way, did you notice a contradiction in what Tom said? It was against the law for people to write fake books, pseudographic books, but he admitted in his supposed rebuttal that there actually were pseudographical writings by the Jews back then. They actually did write fake books back then. And the Septuagint, of course, we know we shouldn't put too much stock in the Septuagint because it's a Greek translation of the one version of the Hebrew Scriptures. But the Septuagint made mistakes too, and one of the most glaring mistakes of the Septuagint was Isaiah 7:14, which, as Tom will tell you, Isaiah 7:14 says, "A young woman shall conceive," alma. When they knew the word virgin was betula, and they used that word, but Isaiah's wife was a young woman, and she conceived and had a son. But Matthew was reading not the Hebrew, he was reading the Greek. He was reading a mistaken translation, because the Greek says parthenos, which means virgin. So Matthew blew it. He was a sloppy scholar when he said, "Oh, look it, a virgin shall conceive." He didn't know that he was reading a corrupted translation from the earlier Hebrew. The Septuagint's not the Word of God, and yet the first century Christians read from the Septuagint, which was in many cases, a bad translation. We learn a lot from it, but we can see that the people who wrote those books were human beings, right? The people who wrote those books down. Human beings make mistakes. We all know that. I make mistakes. Tom makes mistakes. You make mistakes. So what made those ancient writers exempt? They were human beings. They made mistakes. They goofed. They misinterpreted. They borrowed. They sometimes lied in their writings. And even Paul admitted that in the Greek writings. So I guess the point I want to make is Tom didn't really rebut the issues that I raised, and I hope he does. And by the way, he set up a straw man. He said I said something that I didn't say. I did not doubt the historicity of Belshazzar, and yet in Tom's rebuttal, he said that I did doubt the history. And you heard me say earlier that Daniel is irrelevant. Suppose there is one book that actually is truly prophetic. Yeah, does that mean the whole thing? The whole Old Testament? Is that the kind of thinking you have? If you find one truth in there, oh, then the whole thing must be true? My argument is that on balance, even if there is some archaeologically valid sites and names in the Bible, and even if, contrary to my assumptions, there was a fulfilled prophecy, even if that were true, that does not mean that the Old Testament is a historically reliable book. That does not mean that it is not fictional. It is indeed fictional for all the reasons that I gave earlier, those 5 points, which I hope Tom will at least address maybe one of them.
Maybe Mr. Marker might not have read this. He's a very busy man, but we did send him over a month ago on the terms of conditions for the debate. It says in the statement of what we're doing that debate is over the fictional or factual character of the vast general body of the Old Testament. It is a debate over history, prophecy, archaeology, not over creation, evolution in Genesis 1:11, prehistory, geology, or biology. These would be worthwhile debates, but they are for another time. So I wasn't actually expecting to hear much about Genesis 1 through 11 because that was actually in the terms and conditions of the debate. That's a different debate for a different time. I think those are historically accurate documents as well, but I wasn't actually expecting to deal with that because the terms and conditions of the debate said that wasn't actually what we were going to be talking about. Mr. Barker spent a lot of time showing that he didn't like God. He says God is cruel, God is this, and God is that. And again, that's another debate. Actually, his view of morality is far inferior to what the Bible teaches, but that's a different debate. So I'm convinced, I agree, Mr. Barker does not like God. I believe that with all my heart. Okay, it's great. That's not a debate. That's a different debate. He also says that basically some of the things he's saying about this being incredible is basically saying on his view of the world, miracles are impossible. And I agree. If I accept his assumption that miracles are impossible, then yes, we will conclude that the biblical miracles didn't happen. But that's just his presupposition of the impossibility of miracles. He said that he was going to give 5 things in this debate. Number 1 was there is no archaeological evidence for events in the Old Testament. I gave numbers of, I couldn't cover the whole Old Testament in 20 minutes, but I gave many examples of archaeological evidence for things in the Bible. I even showed him pictures of camels when he said there were no camels. We went through all kinds of things. The names of the 3 Hebrew children of Daniel are right there. They're on a document. And this is right there. There's a document. You can see their names there. I gave many examples. The walls of the Babylonian palace have plaster on them. And how is he supposed to know that several centuries later? We've dug this palace up. The walls are exactly what Daniel said. There's lots of things like that I gave. I gave examples where he's quoting Daniel in the 6th century. Now, he says it's not specific. I would encourage the audience to read through Daniel chapter 11, read the pamphlet you have on the back there, see if those prophecies in Daniel 11, Daniel 9, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, see if they're these vague, whatever can mean anything thing, okay? Read them for yourself and see if that's the case. And remember that if this is a document that is written before the time of the Maccabean period, these are clear, unmistakable evidences that there's predictive prophecy validating God's claim that he can predict the future because he's the true God. And that would cover, if he's the true God, then we can conclude that everything in there is true. He said there's these mythical parallels. He didn't give any specifics. He didn't put up a quote of this whatever mythical parallel. That mythical thing is really, really non-historical. It's really bad. I would encourage you to watch Mr. Barker's debate with James White over whether the New Testament, Jesus is a legend. And he says there's these mythical parallels. He thinks that in the Gospel of Mark, it's copying Homer and just all these. It's really, really terrible argument. So we need some specific myths here. Also, a parallel doesn't prove that it's made up anyway. We need something better than this. This is not good history to just cite vague myths of whatever and then nothing specific here. Okay. Historical anachronisms. We didn't get any historical anachronisms, or maybe if I can't think of any. Maybe I'm not infallible. Maybe he gave one that I can't think of. Okay. Historical evidence of. I'm going to give you some more things. He was talking about the Exodus. We mentioned that there's references to Habiru engaging in construction work at the city. We know in the New Kingdom period, which is the period when Israel would have been there were actually many slaves, Canaanite slaves. In fact, the word for Canaanite and slave kind of became synonymous in Egyptian because they had so many slaves then. They didn't have Canaanite slaves in many earlier periods. They didn't have many Canaanite slaves in the later periods when supposedly on these mythical JEDP documents the Old Testament was made up. They didn't have Canaanite slaves really back then. That's kind of interesting situation. His view of the Pentateuch is that it's made up of these 4 documents, which we have no copies of, no evidence, no references to them anywhere in any document that exists. But I'm the one that has an unjustified faith. When he is believing that Moses didn't write it, even though it looks like a treaty format that existed at the time. But no. 1,000 years later, when they didn't even know about this treaty format, somehow JE and DP, who we have no evidence for, kind of came together and here we go, and that's how it came about. That's not good history. We know that there's references to the different places that you can actually, if you get a good book on Old Testament history, like K.A. Kitchen's on the reliability of the Old Testament, or Joseph Free's Archaeology and Bible History, you can actually find the places where they went in the Exodus. You can locate these places. They're actual cities that are there. They're actual places that are there. He said that it took them 40 years to go across. They weren't trying to they weren't like walking like da 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 da, really slow or something. They were stopping in places. Okay, this is not a good argument against the Bible being historical to say that it took them so long. This must be a myth. They were staying in different places. That's just a very bad argument. Kitchen, who is a very, very scholarly man, he was the professor of Egyptology at the School of Archaeology, Classics, Oriental Studies, University of Liverpool. His conclusion was the Exodus is both a viable and realistic proposition. The narratives show a practical knowledge of Sinai conditions, not readily to be gained by late Romance writers in exilic Babylon or an impoverished Persian Hellenic Judea, hundreds of miles from the places of phenomenon in question. So that's pretty clear. He just brought up Isaiah 7:14. The word Alma was a young woman of marriageable age who was a virgin. Israel, if you're a young woman of marriageable age, unlike today, you were a virgin, okay? If you weren't a virgin, bad things would happen to you when you got married. So it was a young woman, yes, but just any young woman. No, she was a young one who was a virgin. He says it should be Bethulah. If Matthew didn't know what he's doing, it should be Bethulah. Joel 1:8 says, lament like a virgin, Bethulah, girded with sackcloth for the husband of her youth. So if it had said Bethulah, he would have said, oh, Joel 1:8, not a virgin. So sorry, actually Alma is a great word to use. And he's saying it's just some young woman giving birth. Okay, let's think about the context of Isaiah 7:14 here. Let's think about this for a second. Isaiah 7:14, Isaiah is trying to give a sign to the king that he can trust God and not give in to this country that had way more military, way more what stuff. Okay, Isaiah says to the king, ask a sign of the Lord your God in heaven above or earth beneath so that you can trust in God. So he's asked for this huge sign. And he says, oh, no, I won't ask for a sign. And so then Isaiah gives a sign that a virgin shall conceive. That's a miracle. A virgin conceiving would be a real sign. A young woman giving birth, okay, listen. King, you can trust God because a woman's going to give birth who's married and just like normal. So, obviously, is that a sign? That's a miracle? No. Alma is Isaiah 7:14 is accurate. It's a virgin shall conceive. That is actually what it is saying. He said that there are 360-day years, but somehow the year is 362.5. So he didn't deny that those countries had years that were 360 days long. And he didn't deny that it worked out to the right day for Christ. Okay? Is that chance? Chance somehow decree, Nehemiah, 360-day year, which is what they had. Oh, wow, somehow it's the right year. Somehow the people who lived back then, the Essenes, the Pharisees, these people who were thinking about Daniel 9, somehow they thought Messiah was coming first century. It's chance, not specific, it's not specific. It is specific. There's other historical things in all kinds of historical stuff that doesn't make sense in later conditions. For example, you're not going to find some scroll or something that says Abraham. Abraham was a nomad. Okay, he wasn't some major, big person. But can you see that this fits the time period that it was written, or does it fit some way later time period? It fits the time period when it was written very, very well. So, for example, when Rachel stole the gods of Laban. And then Laban sent all his guys who was chasing them, and why were they so mad at these gods? Just a bunch of silver, maybe they could buy them on eBay or something, get them back. Well, why were those gods valuable? Because those were the family inheritance. If you had the gods, you actually could take all the inheritance of somebody. That's an example of a custom that was extant at the time that Abraham was supposed to exist, and Jacob and those guys, okay? So we see there's many other things like that where we actually see it fits. Sodom and Gomorrah, we actually know where the cities were. We see that there was actually a time when they were destroyed by fire. That's archaeologically valid. The old Genesis talks about the kings, the 4 kings, the 5 kings. We actually can see the routes that they went. They fit. It fits the time. It fits the time exactly. The tablets that I mentioned, the Nuzi tablets, actually show that possession of the father's household gods plays an important role in the inheritance. During that time, we said there were slaves in Egypt. Canaanite became a synonym for slaves. Okay. We also see that I mentioned already that there's all kinds of other things like that. You can just go through, get a good book on archaeology, look it up. Daniel chapter 11, which he just said it's very vague. Some of these things are not. Oh, the screen isn't even on. Huh? Okay, that's nice. Can we turn that on? There we go. Okay, good. Some of the things in Daniel chapter 11 are not very vague. It says specific things about the kings. It says like who's going to give his wife to the other one. It says about what they're going to do in terms of having these covenants and treaties and so on. It's not vague at all. It's very, very specific. These predictions are not just some sort of weird generalization thing there. And if he says, oh, maybe there was prophecy, maybe it actually is there, well, then it has to be God that did it, because there's no way that the 150 plus things that are specifically mentioned in the book of Daniel chapter 11 and in the other chapters of Daniel, there's no way that could have been just made up by, somehow by chance it just happened. That is not a reasonable explanation of things at all. We have the grammar of the Old Testament, the vowels and the consonants fit comparative Semitic grammar of the other countries that are around there. It fits when it was claimed to have been written, not some way later thing. So this actually fits stuff, okay? It fits the context of when it claims to have been written perfectly, and it doesn't fit later context. Moses in Egypt, when Moses went to Egypt, or Joseph rather, when Joseph went to Egypt, it says that he was in a popular high place, and then there was a time when a Pharaoh came that didn't know Joseph. What was that? How could the Pharaoh not know about Joseph? Well, at that time, there was a group of people called the Hyksos, and they came in, and they were a minority government that ruled over Egypt for a while, okay? So that fits here. Joseph was with the reigning line of kings, and then all of a sudden, this other group of people comes in who are a different group, and they take over, and that's why they don't know who Joseph is. And that minority group, that's why in Exodus it says the Israelites are more numerous than we Egyptians. Well, were the Israelites more numerous than the whole country of Egypt? No, they weren't. But they were more numerous than the minority government that was ruling over the land. So that was a pretty good thing. Somehow later they just knew all these details of these specific things. They fit the history very well. How did they do that? How did they do that? Okay, we have references to, like when the pharaohs came in the 1200s, we have references of them coming in and taking over in the land. There's references to Israelites being there at that time. So that fits. Again, all these things fit very well. We have references to, we see times where they're making straw without bricks, like in the Bible. There's references to that. So all these things fit very, very well. Can you go to the end that I was going to show the slide? Mr. Barker said that he does not have an anti-supernatural bias. I would encourage you to consider whether that really is the case or not. This is what Mr. Barker said. I think it's like one of the last slides. This is what Mr. Barker said in the debate he had with Dr. Bass from Dallas Seminary. He said, even if Jesus did exist, even if I agreed with his opponent, Dr. Bass, 100%, yep, he rose from the dead, yep, there's a God, yep, I don't deny any of that, does not mean that he's my Lord. If he did exist, I will go happily to hell. It would be worse of a hell for me to bow down before a Lord, regardless of the legend and historicity issue. Even if I agreed 100%, I would still reject that being as the Lord of my life, because I'm better than that. I cannot accept Jesus as Lord. You're much more free to live and enjoy your life unshackled from the demands to have some Lord of your life. To me, I think that's more important than all this historicity stuff, which you heard me admit is a matter of probabilities. I might be wrong. That still doesn't mean that Jesus is Lord. He is not the Lord of my life. I'll let you decide if that's bias or not, okay? Don't have that attitude. Be honest with the text of Scripture. It is not made up later. It's true. It has predictive prophecies that are very specific. All the books fit the times that they were written. Don't have the attitude that I am not willing to listen to this evidence because I do not want Jesus to be my Lord. Now, you know what? If that's your attitude, don't even investigate it, because you know what? You'd be better off not knowing the facts. Just go your way, believe your lie, don't get any more evidence for it, because it'll just make your eternal damnation worse, okay? But if that's your attitude, then don't just ignore the facts. Put all of your mind, believe, oh, it's all made up, no camels, no facts that fit these things, not there, believe that, go ahead. But if that's not your attitude, if you are willing to have Jesus as your Lord, if the Bible is true, then look into this. Look into the facts, people. See if this is actually an accurate historical document, in fact, the very revelation of God. And by the way, in terms of the purpose of the debate, Mr. Barker did not even come close to proving that over 50% of the Bible is legend. He made these vague references to things. He didn't even come close to that. Legend, he did not prove that by any means. So I would encourage you to, in this short period of time, can we cover every single thing? We can't cover every single thing. I probably forgot some things that he said. I wasn't trying to. I want to deal with them, but I'm not infallible like the Bible is. So I don't remember everything he said. But there's plenty of evidence for the Bible. There's specific prophecies. We went over lots of them. There's all kinds of evidence. It's true. Thank you.
So this is our final closing, then we do questions?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very good. So we heard another straw man from Tom tonight. I never did say that I have an anti-supernaturalistic bias against miracles. In fact, I have repeatedly said that miracles might happen. What my claim is that they are extremely unlikely. Unlikely. You probably think it's possible that cat spoke to me, don't you? It's possible, but you think it's very unlikely, right? So that's not saying you have an anti-cat speaking bias. It's just saying that you think based on previous knowledge and what we know about the world, you're going to give that an extremely low probability. In fact, in science, scientists will admit, well, we have a 98%, 99%. Let's round it off for now. We're going to go with it as a fact, admitting that they might be wrong. I happily admit I might be wrong. But Tom is right. If the God of the Bible does exist, and if that Jesus actually did exist as presented in the Bible, if it were presented to me as a fact, right? There's Jesus. I have a moral obligation to denounce that monster. I am better than that. I don't send people to eternal torment because they disagree with me. I don't call people fools simply because they've used their brains to come to another conclusion. I don't threaten with violence. I don't threaten genocide of entire nations. I don't put down women and call my lover a whore and a prostitute if she looks at another man. That's what the God of the Bible did all over the place. I don't threaten with pestilence and curses. The covenant of God in the New Testament, really that covenant, you shall love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, was said just before they were going to go in and commit genocide against these people. They're going to harvest crops that they didn't plant and live in cities that they didn't build. They were killing man, women, and children because they worshiped the wrong God. You are better than that. And I am better than that brutal, bloodthirsty monster that's in that book. If he did exist, I would happily go to hell. Happily, proudly, with some integrity, rather than pretend to worship such a monster that we see in the pages of the Bible. Think about it. Use reason. Use morality. Wouldn't you praise somebody who stood up to Hitler and said, nope, put me in the gas chamber, fine. I would rather resist you than go along with your murderous plan for the human race. It's not a bias. I don't say that because I have a bias. I say that because I drew a moral conclusion. I look at the evidence. I look at, he didn't exist, and it's all a fiction. But if he did, then I would denounce him morally. He's cruel. He's not worthy of my respect as a human being. If he wants to prove what a big macho man he is and send me to hell anyway, let him do it. If he's that powerful and that cruel, let him do it. Fine. Does that make it right? Does might make right? Do threats make something morally right? Does stealing and genocide and ethnic cleansing and pestilence and curse hurling and slave mongering, does that make it right because the big powerful God said it? But of course, it's all a myth. It's a good thing it's a myth, isn't it? It's a good thing it's a fiction. I think good Christians and good Jews would prefer that it not be true. Because if it were true, what a horrible world we would live in. So how do you know what is true? How do we actually know what is truth? Jesus said, I am the truth, but truth is not a thing or a person. A person can't be the truth. That's just rhetoric. Truth is the degree with which a statement corresponds with reality. And when you look at the Old Testament, you see that most of it does not correspond with reality. Some of it does. And I repeatedly said, and I think Tom is mischaracterizing what I've been saying tonight, there is some truth in the Old Testament. There is some history in the Old Testament. Big deal. You can find an inscription. Wow, that city did exist. Big deal. But don't you see my comparison with Stephen King? Yeah, but big deal. Are the stories true? Yeah, you might find a certain mountain. You might find a certain piece of pottery. Yeah, great. I agree with you. But are the stories true? Is it a fable or is it a fact? It's not true because your parents say it. It's not true because your church says it. It's not true because your teachers or your preachers or some holy book that you happen to be born into. You happen to be born into this culture. If you were born in Baghdad, it would be the Quran that you'd be worshiping. It's not true because some leaders, dictators, religious masters tell you that it's true. Something is true by observation, not by what you wish, not by what makes you feel good. Truth comes through observation and through reality. By the way, Isaiah 7:14, you're wrong about that. And I'll explain why. If you look at the next verse, look at chapter 8 of the book of Isaiah, we see the fulfillment of that prophecy. It says, behold, a young woman shall conceive. That young woman was the prophet's wife. She did conceive in chapter 8. She did give birth to a son. His name was not Emmanuel. He was supposed to overthrow the Assyrians. That failed. That prophecy, there was a local prophecy made back then in Isaiah 7:14, failed. The Alma was the young wife of the prophet.
I'd like to thank the audience for coming today. Thank you for taking the time to investigate this important topic. I'm thankful for everyone who came out. I'm thankful for Mr. Barker being willing to debate the subject and for all of you for being able to consider this. I'm not going to introduce, in the concluding statement, you're really not supposed to introduce new information, so I'm not really going to be doing that with Mr. Barker's statement because he was introducing lots of new information. You're not supposed to do that in the concluding statement. But I'd like to just remind you of some things that were already said in this debate. He said, facts, we have plenty and plenty of facts. Can I cover every single fact in 20 minutes? No. Here are some facts that this particular book of the Bible, which I was focusing on, which he didn't refute any of these facts, is a 6th century composition written by Daniel. And if it is, There's clear predictive prophecies, and it's historically accurate too, which is what we're talking about here. So Daniel claims to have written his book. If you go through the slides here, he claims to have written it. Next slide. We know that pseudonymity was not acceptable in the canonical books. Now, we're not saying that nobody ever just wrote a story, okay? But in the canon, it wasn't accepted in the canon. That was not an acceptable thing. We see that all the Jews thought that it was written by him all the way back. There's no evidence of anybody else. No Jew saying that it wasn't written by him. No Christian said that it wasn't written by him. We see also that it's quoted by Ezekiel, his contemporary. It specifically says Daniel, referring to his wisdom, referring to his righteousness. As a contemporary, it mentions him in the 6th century. So obviously the book, it exists, okay? It wasn't made up later. We had other references. You can go back to the other slide. It was referenced in Tobit, which is before the time that the prophecies of Antiochus Epiphanes lived. It's referenced in the book of Watchers. It's referenced in Maccabees. This guy in the book of Maccabees speaks about the book of Daniel, Matthias. But Matthias died before the time that the anti-supernaturalist date says the book was written. Okay? So these are facts that show this is a true predictive prophecy, truly historically accurate when it claims to be a 6th century document. Next slide, please. We see that the Septuagint, all the evidence that we have shows that it was written before the time that the anti-supernaturalist date was saying. We have references to Daniel's 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, on actual documents dating back to the time in the 6th century. How did the 2nd century guy know that? We have references to Nebuchadnezzar being the builder of Babylon, which we discovered now, not referenced. There's no way a 2nd century guy would know that things. These are all facts, okay? We know that there are references to the Babylonian walls being plastered, references to the numbering system they had, references to the Babylonian and Persian customs. These are facts, not just made up whatever. And we figured out that Mr. Barker does not like God. And I agree. If that was the debate, whether Mr. Barker likes God or not, I will concede the debate to him. That wasn't the debate tonight. It wasn't about morality. I think he would lose the debate on morality. That wasn't the debate. The debate is whether the Bible is mainly legend or fact. And I've given fact after fact after fact after fact, and he has not dealt with them. We have the cylinder there, the Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah referenced right there on a cylinder. Some of the things he tried to bring up were simply false. There's no evidence. He said there's no extreme statements. And even very few people, no archaeological evidence at all for any of these things. They gave all kinds of examples. We know the slaves were there. We know that the Pentateuch was written in this treaty format that fits the time that it says it was written. Lots of facts. No camels. I showed pictures of camels. Okay. Go to the next one here. The late date is simply anti-supernatural bias. That is the fact. He can say that he's not biased. You can decide for yourself on that quote that he said whether that's biased or not, okay? The book of Daniel is written in 6th century Hebrew, 6th century Aramaic. It does not fit the 2nd century. It's not written, if it was in the 2nd century, it would have Greek stuff in it. We have documents that are earlier than the 2nd century. This is an early document. And if it's early, you read it through. Read Daniel 11. Read Daniel 2 and 7. Read the pamphlet we have back there and see if these are genuine predictive prophecies. He did not deny that from the decree of Nehemiah in 444 BC to the Messiah, he did not deny that it worked out. He just said, they can't have a 360-day year, even though that's what they had. No, they should have used something else. So is the chance that it works out? This isn't some random number. It's not like 26.894 and you make that work out. No, this is the year they had. This is a reasonable interpretation. He did not give any alternative explanation for it. The city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in Daniel chapter 9. He didn't explain. How is that the case? We have copies of Daniel that date to before the Roman times. We have copies of Daniel that date to before the prophecies of Daniel 9 were fulfilled, copies that are older than the time the Romans took power. How did Daniel know about the Romans? How did Daniel know these specific dates? It's because it's historically accurate. Even its predictions are historically accurate. This shows that the Bible is fact, not fiction. Thank you.
All right, the next part is going to be the question portion. Each question will be directed towards one of the debaters, and they will be given a maximum of 1 minute to answer the question, and if they so choose, the other person may respond, and they would have 30 seconds at most. I'm going to try to get through these as quickly as possible as we are running out of time. Thank you. The first question will be for Dan Barker. The question reads, since holidays are established to commemorate historical events like Independence Day, what could be the origin of the Jewish Passover if you deny the historical event of the Exodus?
The Jews, when they celebrate Seder today, and most of my Jewish friends and the rabbis that I know do not think it was a historical event. They think it was a mythological. They say it was an allegorical story. They do not think it was historical. There are some Orthodox Jews who do. But you can celebrate an event that wasn't based in history. That's no big surprise. You can celebrate something that didn't happen, although it was meaningful in your foundational myth of your country. So, and by the way, I wouldn't use the word celebrate, because the Passover is celebrating the death of innocent children who happen to belong to the wrong religion. Bloodshed. Every time I see one of those little matzo crackers, I think dead babies. That's what they're celebrating. The God of the universe killing innocent babies to convince Pharaoh to change his mind. So if they want to celebrate that, fine. But you can celebrate, like Switzerland. Did William Tell actually exist? Probably not. But they still celebrate the foundation of their country by having a celebration over that myth.
The next question.
I'll respond. One, I think it's a good question that the Passover existing would actually support the existence of an actual event. I think it's ironic, as Mr. Barker keeps talking about morality instead of the topic at hand, historicity, that he's in favor of the legality of taking little babies in the womb and murdering them, yet he complains about other types of murder. I think that's an interesting thing. One actual other interesting thing with Passover is actually Passover, this is not an Exodus, but actually we have a reference in an Elephantine document, a command from the Persian king Darius II, the Jews should celebrate the Passover Feast of Unleavened Bread. Oh.
Sorry. Well, the next question will be asked for Mr. Ross here, and it is by an individual named Ed. Archaeology and evidence have shown particular events to be excluded from occurring. Specifically, Jericho was abandoned at the time of the supposed conquering of Canaan and had been for a while. How do you respond to such a statement? Yeah.
First, I would say that actually there is some dispute about when Jericho was destroyed. Garstang actually thought that he found the layer, the archaeologist, when Jericho was destroyed, the demolition layer. That was possible. Some other archaeologists think that actually that whole period of time washed away. Now, if the whole period of time eroded and washed away, then you would not expect to find anything. So for another situation like that, actually where the Israelites were living in Egypt was the Delta region, there's actually no documents practically of any kind of that time. And so slaves living in mud hovels aren't going to write a lot of stuff. So there are certain times where you wouldn't expect, and it'd be unreasonable to expect lots and lots of evidence. So if Garstang is right, we found where Jericho was. If the other guys are right, then it might have all just washed away, and we have no evidence of anything at the time. But that doesn't mean they weren't there.
He seems to be agreeing that there is a lack of evidence then. By the way, I have to say, and this might be irrelevant, but you bordered on slander there by saying that I am a person who supports murder. I do not. And that was below the belt, that was ad hominem, that was unfair. I do not support murder. The God of the Bible does, but I don't.
Thank you. The next question is asked for Mr. Barker. Can you give proof for the historical errors in the Old Testament? For example, can you give proof for there being no domesticated camels in the times of the pharaohs?
Oh. Yeah, well, I will point you to, and I don't have the, well, maybe I can look it up here.
Sorry, my apologies. Sorry. Patriarchs.
Times of the Patriarchs.
Yes.
Yeah, well, Tel Aviv magazine by Israeli scholars who have examined that whole area archaeologically, and I forget the woman's name who was the author of it. You can find it online. Look online, domesticated camels in the time in Israel. My argument was not that there were no camels, and yet Tom seemed to be thinking that was my argument. There were camels. There were camels in the Americas, there were precursors to them. The argument was where they were domesticated camel herds and caravans. There were none, and that article in Tel Aviv magazine points to the archaeological evidence that the introduction of domestic camels to the Middle East, not to the rest of the world, but to the Middle East, was around the year 930 BCE. Before that time, there were no camel herds or populations or camel caravans, in spite of some of these broken fragments that Tom thinks show that they're carrying something on their back.
I'll respond. I think I did show him actual pictures of camels carrying stuff. There's other evidence for camels as well. Genesis does not even say there are these huge herds of camels being raised. There's just a few camels. So if he concedes there are possibilities of a few camels, then there's no historical problem here. He somehow needs to prove that there were no camels and nobody was riding them when they were riding them. Somehow, I don't think you can do that. And the camel argument is not a good one. He's actually arguing some kind of, I think he's a little bit out of date in certain things. Like, there's lots of things that people used to claim there are problems with the Bible that the more we find, they're legitimate.
Right. Mr. Ross, will you agree with the would you agree with the point that one reason for increasing skepticism today is the freedom of information and right to voice skepticism?
I do not think that's a reason why. I think one big reason why skepticism is increasing is because actually in our educational system, you get it pounded into you for years and years and years. For example, when I was growing up, I had evolution pounded into me so hard that I thought if you disagreed with it, you were just some kind of brainless fool. And I hadn't read anything on either side. So I actually think that atheistic bias in our state school system is a very, very good reason for an increasing amount of skepticism. And actually, I think another reason is a lot of corrupt false Christianity. Just because somebody says that he's a Christian does not mean he's a Christian. If you think that salvation is by works, if you think that you're going to heaven because you can speak in tongues, or you ask Jesus into your heart, that doesn't mean you're saved. The Bible says repent and believe the gospel. And there's a lot of corrupt Christianity, and that stuff can't change your life, can't do anything good for you. And so when that turns you off, then you can become, a skeptic or an atheist. And that's very reasonable. You may do less damage that way, actually, than keeping your false Christianity.
I think all of us are skeptics. Every Christian in this room is a skeptic when it comes to someone else's religion. You're skeptical of the Persian religion. You're skeptical of the Muslim religion. You're skeptical of my Native American ancestors' claims of the origin of the earth on the back of a turtle. You are correctly skeptical of those claims. Skepticism is no big new thing. So I think it's probably true that now that the internet has more information out there, it's easier to check up and see why we have good reason to be skeptical of these outrageous claims.
Mr. Barker, how do you explain the finding of chariot wheels and military gear at the bottom of the Red Sea in the place where the Bible claims the Israelites left Egypt?
There was a man who said that he found a chariot wheel under the Red Sea. There is no chariots and there are no wheels. He said there's an 8-spoked wheel, chariot wheel, that he found in the bottom of the Red Sea. Archaeologists have not made that claim. Historians have not made that claim. That was made by an American evangelical preacher who said he saw this wheel with 8 spokes on it, but he misplaced it. Nobody can find it. So, sure, you're going to find some artifacts through history, but if you find an artifact that maybe kind of looks like something that happened in the Bible, does that prove that the Bible actually happened? That's really, really grasping at straws. And in this case, it's a non-existent straw.
I believe you can actually find pictures of the wheel, so it's not non-existent.
This is to Mr. Ross. Why is it permissible for God to have a shifting morality? Deuteronomy 13, 6 through 10. When to stone your family.
Don't start the question until I take a look at it. 6 through 10, right?
What was the verse, Deuteronomy?
13, 6 through 10.
I don't believe that God actually does have a shifting morality. Actually, I think that apart from revelation from God, we actually can't have any justifiable morality of any kind. If we're all just cosmic broccoli, then we actually don't have any significance of any kind. I believe that the laws in the Bible are just, and actually in a theocratic system, God was actually, with the Canaanites, so in this passage, I think it was a right law in Deuteronomy 13. And also, if you're going to have when they came into the land of Canaan, if you can dry up the Red Sea and you can make plagues come and you can make manna come and you can make the day last longer, if that's the only time you have any kind of aggressive war, how many aggressive wars are we going to have? I don't think we're going to have very many. So there's actually, I think the biblical morality is totally justifiable. And if you're going to attack biblical morality, first we need to establish what our objective basis is to attack it. Otherwise, we're borrowing from the Bible. We're borrowing from biblical morality to attack it.
It doesn't matter what you believe, Tom. You can have your beliefs. We all have our beliefs. You can believe what you want about your God. Christians today think slavery is wrong. I don't think any Christians today believe in slavery. But the Old Testament is a slave manual. Right after the Ten Commandments, the God of the Bible tells them what to do, how to buy slaves. You pay more for a male slave than a female. And if they have children, well, the children have to stay with the master. The master can do what he wants sexually with the female slave. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there about nothing anti-slavery in the Old Testament or in the New Testament. So there is indeed a shifting morality in the Bible.
I'd like somebody to ask me a question about slavery in the Bible.
For the sake of time, I am only going to ask 4 more questions, 2 for each speaker. This question goes for Mr. Barker. There is evidence of giants. Skeletons were even found in Wisconsin. So are giants really mythical?
Well, if by giant you mean a big person, yeah. There's always going to be somebody at the tail end of the bell curve. You're going to find some individuals in every population that you would call, there's probably some in this room, right? Andrew. Stand up, Andrew. Is he a giant or what? No? Well, he's a pretty big guy. But there's no evidence of giants. There's no evidence of the Nephilim, who were supposedly the offspring of the sons of God with the daughters of men because they saw they were fair. Actually, intercourse between angels and human females. There's no evidence of any of those giants. And there should be thousands of skeletons in graveyards of the supposed race of giants that the Israelites were afraid of. There's not.
You have plenty of examples of large people today. Arguing that some people in the Bible were large is not a very good argument. I think it's an argument that evidences anti-supernaturalist bias. It talks about large people, they're giant, they want to fight. I'd rather be big if I was going to fight. That's not a very good argument. I also think the sons of God, daughters of men passage is actually about the sons of God were actually the godly line, and the daughters of men were the ungodly line, so actually that isn't anything there anyway. He's trying to get mileage out of something that is not there to get mileage out of.
The next question is for Mr. Ross. Do you believe your wife, sister, or mother, when she was younger, should sit on a pillow throughout her menstruation because she is/was unclean?
There are ceremonial laws and civil laws and moral laws in the Old Testament, and those are not just arbitrary classifications. They are justifiable. Some of the ceremonial laws of Israel were actually to set them apart as a people. They did have a good purpose. They distinguished them from the other nations. So I think that law did help classify them as separate from the other people. And so that's what it was. I don't think that, so no, does my wife do that? No, she doesn't go on a pillow, if you're wondering.
So I would say that that's some evidence that a lot of the Old Testament is irrelevant to today. We're better than that. If you want to consider those ceremonial laws, you could say the same thing about the laws against homosexuality in the Bible, which were considered during the Holiness Code, ceremonial laws, that was for that time, but not for today. It's wonderful that we now have gay marriage, which is an improvement over the old ceremonial laws of the Old Testament.
Next question is asked by Luke Rains and is for Mr. Barker. If reason is the basis of truth, how can man know the truth if man is not all-knowing?
Well, that question assumes that the truth is a thing. Truth is not a thing. You put a capital T on it, doesn't mean, oh, there's truth somewhere. Truth is just a label for the degree with which a statement corresponds with reality. So the way to know is to look at that statement and see if it corresponds to some degree or another. If it corresponds high enough, we say, yep, that's true. If it doesn't, we say no. The only way to do that is through observation. There were a lot of Christians who used to believe that men had one fewer rib than women because the Bible says that. They believed it. I knew people that. Observation shows us that that's just not true.
But the Bible never says all men have one fewer rib than women. That is simply not in there. I would suggest that he tries to do a better job finding contradictions in the Bible.
I never said the Bible said that.
Okay, well, it sounded kind of like it. I thought, okay, maybe you didn't say that. Okay, fine.
I said Christians believe it.
I would suggest that, Christians believe all kinds of things that are weird.
Yeah.
So do atheists. But that doesn't prove that it's false. I would suggest that logic, the scientific method, even making objective claims, like when Mr. Barker said truth is not a thing, he's making an objective claim of truth. He's claiming it's true that truth is not a thing. He's actually borrowing from the biblical system of thought to attack it.
And last question is from J.D., and this is for Mr. Ross. Prophecies in one book do not establish the legitimacy of the Bible. What evidence from other books do you believe establishes the biblical legitimacy?
One thing I would say that the books are there is a kind of unity to them. If one actually gives evidence that the Jehovah God of the Bible exists and there's clear evidence for that, that would be a good reason to include the rest of them are true. That isn't the only book with that kind of evidence. There's actually thousands. There's over 1,800 predictions in the Bible that are very specific. There's hundreds of messianic prophecies. The Bible is also confirmed by archaeology. And most of all, the risen Lord and Savior, the creator of the universe, Jesus Christ, actually said the Bible is true, and that's a great reason to believe it. And also, I know the author, and since I've come to know him, I know for sure that it's true.
I used to believe that I knew the author, but now I know I was deluding myself. Those who claim to know Jesus don't. You have an idea in your mind, but you actually don't have. And if you're going to use personal experience to validate the historicity of an ancient collection of books, that's really stretching. I mean, that's really sophomoric. You should look at it on its own merits and not inject your own personal bias and presupposition against the natural. It was what you seem to have, accusing me of the opposite presupposition. So let's go where the evidence leads. Let's use reason. Let's use kindness. And let's follow the facts wherever they might lead. In my case, they lead away from the factual Old Testament.
All right. Real quick here, how about a round of applause for our two debaters?
Thank you, Mr. Barker.
Good guy. You're very articulate.
I'd like to thank those who helped me make the slides, too. I am not good at making slides. That was so helpful. Thank you very much, my slide makers.
Do either of you two have anything else you wish to sort of plug here before we start closing up?
So my current book is called Life-Driven Purpose, which turns Rick Warren upside down. The purpose-driven life is the wrong way to look at the world. You can find that online. But my new book, God, the most unpleasant character in all fiction. I can't wait till that comes out. We want to get it in every hotel room in the country.
I would encourage those that have come to this debate to check out my website, faithsaves.net. I'd also encourage you to get a copy of that book in the back on the historicity of Daniel and the prophecies. That's also on the website. Updating a little bit, there's a lot of other resources, scholarly resources giving evidence for the Bible is true. And I would encourage you also to consider the Bible actually is there's lots of evidence for it, but it's also self-attesting. If you're honest with it and you read it carefully, read the Gospel of John, you'll see that it actually is true. It's actually God's own word. Thank you very much for coming.
All right. As president of the Philosophy Club, I'm going to plug my organization as well, very shamelessly. We meet every Thursday in room 2314 here in Highland from 6:15 to 7:15 and debate various topics that are democratically chosen. I know it's been a long night, and I thank all of you for coming out to see this, and I wish you all a pleasant evening.